In the early hours, before the neighborhood fully woke, Martin sat at the edge of his bed and listened to the quiet in his house. A heater clicked once and went still. The window held a faint reflection of his face, softer than it used to be, and he watched it without judging it. On the chair near the closet, a stack of folded clothes leaned slightly to one side, as if it had grown tired of being arranged. Martin was 62, and the habit of preparing had never left him. In his working years, preparation had been a kind of safety. Lists, calendars, reminders, a tight grip on every hour. Even after he stopped working, his days stayed packed, as if empty space would invite trouble. He helped a neighbor with errands. He volunteered at a local community room. He took every call that came in, even the ones that felt like obligations dressed up as friendship. He told himself he was staying useful. That morning he stared at the planner on his dresser. It was open to a page filled with neat ink. The day held a grocery run, a pickup, a quick stop, a favor, and a visit that had been scheduled out of habit rather than desire. He felt a familiar pressure in his chest, the quiet demand to move. Then he noticed how tired he was of moving. In the kitchen, he made coffee and stood by the sink while it brewed. The smell was steady and simple. He watched the dark stream fill the pot, and the small act slowed him down. He remembered how years ago he could sit for a few minutes without feeling guilty. He remembered how calm used to arrive on its own, without needing to be earned. When the coffee was ready, he carried a mug to the table and sat. He did not open his phone. He did not reach for the planner. He let the mug warm his hands. Outside, a single bird called once, and then the street went quiet again. The day did not rush him. The day waited. Martin understood in a clear and ordinary way that he had been treating peace like a reward, something that would show up after everything else was handled. But everything else never ended. There was always another request, another task, another reason to stay braced. He took a slow sip and made a small choice that felt almost strange. He crossed out one item on the planner, then another. He did not replace them. He left white space on the page and watched himself tolerate it. The empty space did not become danger. It became air. By mid-morning, he walked outside and took a short loop around the block. The sidewalks were damp from overnight dew. The trees stood still, bare and patient. He felt his shoulders lower, as if his body had been holding itself up too long. He returned home and noticed the house felt larger. Not because the rooms had changed, but because his attention was no longer crowded. Letting go, he realized, was not a dramatic event. It was a quiet practice. It was a decision to stop gripping what could not be controlled. It was a willingness to allow a day to be ordinary, and to trust that ordinary could still be enough. In the afternoon, a message arrived from someone who often needed something. Martin read it once and felt the old reflex to respond immediately. His thumb hovered over the screen. Then he placed the phone face down on the table and let a few minutes pass. The pause felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping off a moving walkway. In the quiet, he noticed that urgency had been living inside him even when nothing urgent was happening. He walked to the living room and opened a curtain. Light fell across the floor in a pale rectangle. Dust floated slowly in it, unbothered by schedules. The sight made him smile without meaning to. There had been years when he could notice a beam of light and feel nothing but gratitude. The gratitude had not vanished. It had been buried under motion. Later, he returned to the phone and answered the message with fewer words than usual. He did not explain. He did not apologize. He simply offered what he could and left the rest alone. After he sent it, he waited for the expected guilt. it did not arrive. What arrived was a quiet steadiness, as if something inside him had stopped performing. As evening came on, he warmed a simple meal and ate it without standing at the counter. He washed the plate and set it on the rack. The house remained calm. There were still things to do tomorrow. There always would be. But the day, as it ended, felt complete. In that completion, he sensed the beginning of a different rhythm. Not a perfect rhythm, and not a dramatic reinvention. Just a slower life, shaped by small releases. A calendar with room to breathe. A mind that did not need to be held open by noise. A body that could finally rest without waiting for permission. Elena kept a box in the back of her closet that she never opened on purpose. It sat behind winter coats and an old suitcase with a broken zipper, pressed into the corner where her hands would not brush it by accident. The box was not large, and it was not heavy. Still, she treated it like something that could change the air in the room. Eleanor was 59. Her home was tidy, her kitchen counters mostly clear, her laundry folded the same way each time. Friends described her as organized. They said it as praise. What they did not see was how much effort her order required. She cleaned not only to keep the house pleasant, but to keep her mind quiet. If the surfaces were clear, the thoughts stayed calmer. If the drawers closed smoothly, her life felt like it had a shape. On a grey Saturday, rain tapping against the windows, she decided to open the closet and pull out the box. The decision did not feel brave. It felt tired. She had been carrying it for years without touching it, and she wanted to stop carrying it. She set the box on the bed and sat beside it for a long moment. The cardboard had softened at the corners. Tape ran across the top in 2 strips, yellowed with time. Her hands rested on her knees. She breathed slowly until the small tension behind her ribs eased. Inside the box were objects that belonged to a different part of her life. A stack of photographs, a small glass ornament, a folded program from a ceremony, a handwritten note on the thin paper. None of the items were valuable in the usual sense. Their value was in what they held. They held an older Elena, who had once believed that the past could be kept intact if it was stored carefully. She lifted the photographs first. The edges were curled, and some had faded to warm sepia tones. Faces looked up at her from earlier years. A smile caught mid-laugh, a hand resting on a shoulder. A room lit by a lamp that she no longer owned. The images were tender and ordinary, and the ordinariness made them ache. Elena did not cry in a dramatic way. She simply felt a slow pressure behind her eyes, the body's way of admitting what the mind has tried to keep contained. The grief was not only about loss, it was about the effort of pretending that time could be managed like a closet. She set the photographs down and picked up the glass ornament. It was small, shaped like a simple star. The surface was scratched. She remembered how she used to hang it near a window so it would catch light. The memory arrived without forcing itself, and she noticed that remembering did not harm her. It softened her. For years, Elena had treated these objects like dangerous sparks. She believed that if she looked too closely, she would be pulled backward. But on that rainy day, she felt something different. She felt that the past did not need to be sealed away to be survived. It could be held gently, then returned to its place. She sorted the items slowly. A few things she kept. A few she placed into a smaller envelope. The rest she set aside, not with contempt, but with gratitude. She recognized that keeping everything was not respect. It was fear. It was the refusal to let life move. When the box was lighter, she closed it again. but the closure felt different. It no longer felt like hiding. It felt like settling. She put the box back, and then she did something new. She opened the window a crack and listened to the rain. The air smelled clean. The room felt larger. Eleanor understood that letting go can be quiet and practical. It can look like releasing objects. It can also look like releasing the belief that the past must be protected from change. The memories remained. The love remained. The box, finally, did not need to hold her together. That evening, she made tea and carried it to the couch. The house lights were low. The rain had softened into a steady whisper. She noticed that her shoulders were not tight, and her jaw was not clenched. The closet door was still closed. The difference was that it no longer felt like a locked room in her mind. Later, she took a small walk through the rooms and adjusted nothing. She did not straighten pillows or wipe an already clean counter. She allowed a book to remain open on the chair. The small mess did not become chaos. It became evidence of living. In bed, she felt a calm fatigue, the kind that comes from spending effort on something honest. The past had been faced without drama. It had been placed back down without struggle. In the quiet, she felt the simple relief of no longer guarding a box as if it were a warning. Ravi used to believe that discipline was the same thing as peace. He had built his life around control. He woke early. He kept his meals simple. He worked with steady focus. His phone was organized into tidy folders. His closets looked as if no one lived there. The order was impressive. It also left him tired in a way he did not know how to explain. Ravi was 54. In the last year, his body had begun to speak more loudly. Not with illness and not with alarm, but with limits. A stiffness in the morning that took longer to soften. A dull ache after a day on his feet. A growing need for rest that did not respond to pride. He found himself irritated by how ordinary these changes were, as if the body should negotiate with him. On a Sunday afternoon, he stood in the grocery store and stared at a shelf of snacks. Years ago, he would have walked past without looking. Now he paused. The pause was not about hunger. It was about noticing how much of his life had become a refusal. He refused ease. He refused pleasure. He refused the kind of softness that makes a day feel human. He told himself he was being strong. He left the store with the same items he always bought. Still, the moment stayed with him. At home, he sat at the table and looked at the clean lines of his kitchen. Everything was in its place. The silence felt thin. His mind kept scanning for the next thing to manage. Later, he opened his laptop and began sorting files. The task he often used to quiet himself. He renamed folders. He deleted duplicates. He chased the small satisfaction of completion. The hours passed. In the evening, he felt the familiar emptiness that arrived after a day that looked productive but did not feel lived. Ravi stood at the sink and washed a cup, even though there were no other dishes. His hands moved automatically. His thoughts moved faster. He realized he had been using control as a shelter. If he kept everything perfect, he would not need to feel what he was avoiding. He turned off the bright overhead light and left a single lamp on in the living room. The softer light changed the room's edges. The change was small. Still, it felt like a message. A life does not need to be held at full brightness all the time. Sometimes calm arrives when the glare is lowered. He sat on the couch and allowed himself to do nothing. He did not scroll news. He did not plan the week. He watched the quiet settle. At first, it felt uncomfortable, like standing in open space without a railing. Then his breathing slowed. In that slow space, Ravi understood something he had resisted. Control can look like maturity. It can also be fear dressed in clean clothing. It can be the refusal to accept that life is not a system that can be perfected. The next day, he made a small decision. He left one task unfinished. He did not rush to close it. He allowed the day to end with a little imperfection, and he noticed that the world did not collapse. The unfinished thing did not chase him in the night. Over time, he began practicing a quieter form of strength. Not the strength of tightening, but the strength of loosening. Not the strength of denying, but the strength of allowing. In that practice, peace stopped being a prize at the end of discipline. It became something that could exist alongside an ordinary, imperfect life. A week later, Ravi visited a small library and walked the aisles slowly. He was not searching for improvement. He was searching for a quiet hour. He chose a thin book of essays and sat near a window. Outside, winter light moved across the pavement in gentle shifts. He read a few pages, then paused to stare at nothing in particular. The pause did not feel wasted. It felt like his attention returning to its own size. On the way home, he stopped at a small shop and bought a simple pastry. The purchase was not indulgent in any dramatic sense. It was ordinary. He ate it at the table with a cup of coffee and let the sweetness exist without argument. He noticed how quickly his mind tried to label the moment as unnecessary. He noticed how quickly the label faded when he did not feed it. That night, he went to bed earlier. The sheets felt cool. The room was dim. He fell asleep with fewer thoughts running in circles. In the morning, the stiffness was still there. The limits were still there. The difference was that he was no longer fighting them, as if fighting could turn back time. Letting go, for Ravi, began as a small surrender of perfection. It widened into something deeper, a willingness to live without constant supervision, a willingness to be a person instead of a project. Diane kept an old grievance the way some people keep a sharp stone in a pocket. She rarely touched it directly, but she always knew it was there. It sat inside her thoughts and made certain moments heavier than they needed to be. A holiday dinner, a family message, a photograph that appeared unexpectedly. The stone would press against her, reminding her of what had happened long ago. Diane was 67. The original event was not complicated. It was an argument in a kitchen, a raised voice, a decision made in anger, and a silence that grew wider over years. The details had faded, but the feeling had not. The feeling stayed polished, as if she had been turning it over in her mind for decades. In the spring, Diane went to a small community gathering in a room with folding chairs and a table of coffee and fruit. She attended because it was nearby, and because she had promised herself she would stop living only inside her house. The gathering was quiet. People spoke softly. Someone arranged paper cups in neat rows. The room smelled faintly of citrus. Near the end, an older man stood and spoke about time in a calm, plain way. He described how certain emotions do not burn out on their own. They are fed by repetition. He described how a person can mistake loyalty to pain for strength. Diane listened without reacting. Still, something in her loosened. At home that evening, she took out a photo album from a shelf. The album was thick, the pages stiff, the plastic covers cloudy. She turned pages slowly. Faces appeared. Children in bright clothes. A younger Diane with darker hair. A brother standing beside her, his arm around her shoulders. Both of them smiling as if they had never learned to be separate. She stopped on one image and felt the familiar press of the stone. Then she noticed something new. The feeling was no longer sharp. It was dull, like an ache that had become part of the body. The ache did not protect her. It only kept her tense. Diane closed the album and sat with it in her lap. She did not try to rewrite history. She did not excuse what had happened. She simply admitted a quiet truth. The grievance had become a way to keep the past active. As long as she held it, she did not need to face the emptiness underneath it. The emptiness was not dramatic. It was the simple absence of connection. It was the absence of a voice that used to be familiar. It was the absence of small shared memories that other families seemed to carry easily. The next morning, she made coffee and sat at the table with her phone. She stared at a number she had not called in years. Her hand shook slightly, not with fear of rejection, but with the weight of habit. She had practiced distance so long that closeness felt like a risk. She did not call that day. Instead, she wrote a short note on paper. The note was plain. It held no accusations. It held no careful explanations. It only held a simple reach toward repair. She folded it once and placed it in an envelope. When she mailed it, she felt no sudden relief. She felt something steadier. She felt as if she had set down a stone that had been carried too far. In the weeks that followed, there were no dramatic reconciliations. There was, however, a change in Diane's body. Her shoulders were less rigid. Her sleep was less interrupted. She found herself watching the light shift in her living room without the old tension rising. Letting go did not erase the past. It changed the relationship to the past. It allowed the present to have room. It allowed peace to be something that could exist without requiring a perfect history. One afternoon, she walked to a nearby bench and sat for a while, hands folded in her lap. The trees were moving in a slow wind. A child's laughter carried from a distance, then faded. Diane noticed how the world continues regardless of what is held inside a person. The continuation was not cruel. It was simply real. Later, a short response arrived in the mail. The handwriting was familiar. The words were careful. Not warm, but not closed. Diane read the note once, then again. She felt a quiet gratitude for something small. A door was not fully opened. Still, it was no longer locked. That night, she returned the photo album to the shelf and turned off the living room light. She left a lamp on and let the room soften. The stone was still part of her history. It no longer needed to be carried everywhere. The day ended without drama, and that quiet ending felt like progress. Oscar had a habit of checking updates the way some people check locks. He did it without thinking. A glance at headlines while coffee brewed. A scroll while waiting at a red light. A refresh before bed. He told himself he was staying informed. The truth was simpler. He was staying braced. Oscar was 51. In earlier years, he could move through a day with a mind that felt mostly his own. Over time, the stream of information had filled the empty spaces. Every pause became an opening for noise. Every quiet moment became a chance to look for something that might go wrong somewhere else. One morning, his phone battery died before he left the house. The screen went black without warning. He stared at it as if it had betrayed him. He searched for a charger, then realized the charger was in the car. He felt irritation rise, followed by a thin unease. The device was not only a tool, it was a small pacifier for the nervous system. Oscar drove anyway. Without the phone, the car felt strangely empty. The radio stayed off. The road sounds became louder. Tires on pavement, a passing truck, wind around the windows. At first, he felt restless. His mind kept reaching for input the way a hand reaches for a railing. Then, as the drive continued, something else happened. The restlessness began to fade. His breathing slowed. He noticed the color of the sky. He noticed a field on the edge of town with wiggin winter grass lying flat yet in the wind. He noticed a line of bare trees holding their shape against light. At work, he borrowed a charger and turned the phone back on. Notifications arrived in a tight cluster. Messages, headlines, alerts. He watched his body tighten as if preparing for impact. Nothing in the notifications required immediate action. Still, they asked for his attention in the same urgent tone. That evening, Oscar sat at the table and considered a small experiment. He set the phone in a drawer and closed it. He left it there while he cooked a simple meal. He ate without reading. He washed the plate. The minutes felt longer, not because time had changed, but because he was no longer slicing it into fragments. After dinner, he sat in a chair near a lamp and listened to the quiet. The house made small sounds. A pipe settling. A distant car. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt like space returning to him. Oscar noticed how quickly his mind tried to create drama. It searched for something to react to. When it found nothing, it began to settle. The settling was not instant. It came in small steps, like a lake smoothing after wind. In the days that followed, he repeated the experiment. He did not quit information entirely. He simply gave it boundaries. He checked once in the morning and once in the late afternoon. The rest of the day, he let the world exist without commentary. A surprising thing happened. His thoughts became less sharp. His mood became less reactive. Sleep came more easily. He began to notice small pleasures that had been drowned out. The taste of coffee, the warmth of sunlight on a floor, the quiet comfort of a clean room. Letting go for Oscar was not about ignorance. It was about reclaiming attention. It was about learning that peace does not arrive from collecting more warnings. Peace arrives when the nervous system is allowed to stand down. On a Saturday, he left the phone at home and walked to a small park. The path was damp and lined with pale stones. A few people passed in quiet motion. A dog trotted beside an older woman. Oscar walked without tracking steps, without photographing anything, without turning the moment into proof. He sat on a bench and watched the slow pattern of leaves moving along the edge of a pond. The water held a faint reflection of clouds. The scene was not exciting. That was the point. His mind, so used to stimulation, began to accept that a day could be plain and still feel complete. In the afternoon, he returned home and noticed how calm the house felt without constant sound. He opened a book he had owned for years and read a few pages. His attention held to the words. It did not dart away. He felt a quiet pride, not in productivity, but in the simple act of being present. That night, he charged the phone and placed it face down on the counter. He went to bed with the room dim and the mind less crowded. the world had not become safer. The difference was that his attention was no longer spending itself on distant alarms. The attention was staying closer, where life was actually happening. Camilla had been the steady one for as long as she could remember. In her family, she was the person who kept track of birthdays, who remembered appointments, who noticed when someone's voice sounded tired. She was the one who drove across town with groceries, the one who answered late calls, the one who offered solutions before anyone finished describing the problem. Camilla was 60. She did not see herself as heroic. She saw herself as responsible. Responsibility, in her mind, was love. If she stayed on top of everything, the people she cared about would be safe. Over the years, the responsibility became a shape she could not step out of. Family members grew used to her availability. Friends leaned on her in quiet ways. Even strangers asked for help, because she looked like someone who would say yes. Camilla did say yes. She said it so often that she forgot what it felt like to have an afternoon that belonged to nobody else. One winter evening, she arrived home after a long day and stood in the entryway without turning on a light. The house was quiet. Her coat felt heavy on her shoulders. Her hands ached slightly from gripping a steering wheel and carrying bags. She felt an emptiness that was not loneliness. It was exhaustion. It was the sense that her attention had been poured out until there was nothing left. She sat on the couch and stared at the dark window. Outside, a streetlight cast a pale glow on wet pavement. The world looked calm. Inside, her mind kept running through lists. Who needed a callback? What errands were still undone? What problem might appear overnight? The thought pattern felt endless. Camilla realized, with a clarity that startled her, that constant caretaking had become a way to avoid her own life. As long as she was needed, she did not have to sit with her own quiet. She did not have to ask what she wanted. Need gave her identity. Need gave her structure. Need also kept her tired. The next day, a request arrived for something minor. In the past, she would have answered immediately, rearranging her plans without noticing. This time, she paused. She set the phone down and made tea. She watched steam rise from the cup. The pause made room for a new thought. The request was not urgent. The urgency was inside her. She answered later with a simple refusal. Not harsh, not dramatic, just a clean boundary. After she sent the message, she waited for backlash. She waited for guilt. Instead, she felt her chest loosen, as if a tight band had been unfastened. In the following weeks, Camilla practiced small releases. She did not stop caring. She stopped overextending. She chose one day each week when she would not schedule favors. She left her evenings quieter. She allowed others to solve their own small problems. The change was not immediately comfortable. The new space felt strange at first. It felt like standing in a quiet room and realizing how loud the mind has been. But as the days passed, the space began to feel like rest. One afternoon, she took a slow walk and noticed how her body responded. Her shoulders dropped. Her jaw unclenched. Her breathing moved lower. The peace she felt was not the peace of a perfect family. It was the peace of a person who had stopped abandoning herself. Letting go, for Camilla, meant releasing the belief that love must always be proved through effort. Love could still be steady. It could also be balanced. The life around her did not collapse when she held a boundary. The life around her simply adjusted. And in that adjustment, she found room to breathe. On a quiet evening, she cooked a simple meal and ate it at the table with a small candle burning. She left the television off. The flame moved slightly with each shift of air. The room felt softer. She noticed that she could hear her own thoughts without panic. The thoughts were ordinary. They did not require immediate action. Later, someone did call with a problem. Camilla listened carefully and offered one small suggestion. Then she let the conversation end without taking the problem into her own hands. When she hung up, she felt the old reflex to keep thinking. She watched the reflex rise and pass. The problem belonged to someone else. Her attention could return home. In bed, she expected to lie awake, restless in the new space. Instead, sleep arrived more quickly than it had in months. The body had been waiting for permission to stand down. The permission, she realized, could be given one small boundary at a time. At 66, Jerome carried a small stack of business cards in his wallet, even though he no longer needed them. The cards were clean, with his name printed in dark letters and a title that had once mattered. He had retired 2 years earlier. Still, he kept the cards as if removing them would erase a part of him. In his working life, Jerome's days had structure. Meetings, projects, calls, deadlines. The rhythm had been demanding, but it had also been clarifying. People asked for his opinion. People thanked him for decisions. People relied on him. When he stopped working, the reliance faded. The phone rang less, the calendar emptied. His identity began to feel porous. Jerome told himself he enjoyed the freedom. He filled the new space with chores and errands. He made small projects out of organizing a garage, repainting a room, replacing a worn handle. The tasks were fine. They did not touch the deeper unease. The unease was not boredom. It was a quiet question about who he was when no one needed his title. One afternoon, he found himself standing in a hardware aisle, staring at shelves of screws and anchors, unable to remember why he had come. The moment was small, but it exposed something. He had been using tasks to avoid the feeling of being unmoored. If he stayed busy, he would not need to feel the loss of role. He went home with nothing and sat at his kitchen table. The house was quiet. Light moved across the floor in a slow angle. He noticed his wallet on the counter, and beside it, the small stack of cards. The cards felt like a tiny badge. Jerome opened the wallet and took them out. He held them for a moment and looked at the printed title. The letters were still crisp. The meaning behind them had changed. The meaning had always been partly borrowed from other people's recognition. Without the recognition, the title was just ink. He placed the cards on the table and stared at them. He did not feel anger. He felt a kind of sadness that was gentle and clean. It was the sadness of realizing that identity can be built on structures that do not last. In the evening, he walked outside and took a slow route through his neighborhood. Porch lights were beginning to turn on. A dog barked once and went quiet. A car door closed in the distance. The ordinary sounds grounded him more than he expected. He returned home and made soup. The steam rose in a steady way. He ate slowly, then washed the bowl and set it on the rack. The evening felt plain. Still, it did not feel empty. Over the next week, Jerome began testing a different kind of identity. He offered help when it felt genuine. He declined when it felt performative. He spent an hour reading, not to learn something useful, but to enjoy the shape of a sentence. He called an old friend and listened without needing to impress. The business cards remained on the table for several days. Each time he saw them, he felt the old tug to keep them. Then he felt something newer. He felt that clinging was not respect. It was fear of becoming invisible. On a quiet morning, he threw the cards away. The act was small. Still, he noticed a shift in his chest, as if he had unhooked from a role that was no longer his. Letting go did not remove his competence. It removed the need to prove it. Peace, he realized, was not the absence of purpose. It was the absence of pretending. It was the freedom to be a person without a label, living inside ordinary days with attention and care. He began spending time in a small patch of yard behind the house where a few stubborn plants returned each year. In earlier years, the yard work felt like another responsibility. Now it became a quiet ritual. He pulled weeds slowly. He turned soil. He watered without rushing. The work had no praise attached to it. That was part of the relief. As the weeks passed, Jerome noticed that purpose can be smaller than ambition and still be real. A clean sink at night, a long walk on a cool afternoon, a call returned without delay, a simple meal cooked with attention. These were not accomplishments the world would measure. They were acts of living. Letting go of the old title did not solve everything. Some mornings still felt blank. Some afternoons still carried restlessness. But the restlessness no longer needed to be disguised as productivity. It could be met with patience and then allowed to pass like weather. In that patience, the days began to feel less like a problem and more like a place. He stayed with them quietly. Nora had a way of replaying conversations long after they ended. She would stand at the sink washing dishes and hear a sentence again, then again, searching for what she should have said differently. In the car, she would revise the tone of her voice, the timing of a pause, the choice of a word. She told herself she was thoughtful. The truth was that she was rehearsing, and the rehearsing kept her tense. Nora was 58. In earlier years, her carefulness had been a kind of armor. If she said the right thing, she would not be judged. If she managed people's impressions, she would not be rejected. The strategy worked well enough to become a habit. The habit followed her into older years, even as her energy for it began to thin. One evening, she attended a small dinner with friends. The meal was simple. The lighting was warm. The conversation moved in a gentle rhythm. Nora laughed at the right moments and listened closely. But she also watched herself from a distance, tracking whether she seemed pleasant, whether she seemed interesting, whether she was taking up too much space. When she returned home, she felt a familiar exhaustion. Nothing had gone wrong. Still, her mind began its usual review. She stood in the bathroom brushing her teeth and replayed small moments. The replaying made them feel larger than they were. Nora turned off the bathroom light and walked into the dim bedroom. A lamp cast a soft circle onto the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed and noticed her chest felt tight. She wondered in a plain and quiet way how many hours of her life had been spent in this private second shift. Not working, not living, but reviewing. The next day, she decided to practice something different. She met a friend for coffee and allowed the conversation to be imperfect. She did not correct herself mid-sentence. She did not force a laugh. She let pauses happen. She noticed that the pauses did not create danger. They created space. Later, as she walked home, she felt a small relief. The relief was not about social success. It was about the energy saved when performance stops. Nora began noticing how much peace is lost to the desire to manage. Managing a room, managing a tone, managing the image of being fine. These efforts are quiet. They can look invisible from the outside. Inside, they consume attention. Over the next weeks, she practiced a gentle form of letting go. She answered messages when she could, not immediately. She left a minor misunderstanding unresolved when it did not matter. She allowed someone else's mood to belong to them. She stopped taking responsibility for smoothing every edge. The shift affected her body. She slept more deeply. Her jaw was less tense. She felt less drained after ordinary encounters. She began to enjoy the simple act of being with people she liked, without the constant task of managing their experience. One night, she sat at her kitchen table after dinner with a cup of tea. The house was quiet. She noticed the absence of replaying. The mind was not reviewing. It was resting. Letting go, she realized, is often the decision to stop refining what cannot be perfected. A conversation does not need to be flawless to be real. A person does not need to be impressive to be loved. Peace is not built from control. It is built from presence, allowed to be ordinary. On a quiet Saturday, Nora cleaned a small drawer in her kitchen and found an old notebook she had once used for lists. The pages held tidy handwriting and small checkboxes, evidence of how she had tried to organize not only tasks but feelings. She sat at the table and wrote a few sentences, not as a plan, but as a release. She wrote that she was tired of grading herself. She wrote that she wanted the older years to be lighter. The writing was simple. Still, it felt like opening a window. In the afternoon, she visited a bookstore and wandered without buying anything. She touched the spines of books and read the first lines of a few pages. She watched other people move slowly. No one was rushing. No one was evaluating her. The store held a quiet permission to be anonymous. That evening, she returned home and cooked a meal with no music and no background noise. The chopping sounds were clear. Water ran into a pot. Steam rose. She ate and washed the dishes. The day felt finished without needing to be recorded or optimized. The next time she met friends, she still felt the old reflex to perform. The reflex did not vanish. The difference was that she recognized it as reflex, not necessity. She let it pass. Her laughter came more naturally. Her attention stayed in the room. Peace, for Nora, began with a small surrender. The surrender was not weakness. It was the release of a long effort to be polished. In the release, she found something steadier than approval. She found a calm sense of belonging to her own life. Clara had always been someone who kept the house full of sound. A radio in the morning, a television in the evening, a podcast while cooking. She told herself she liked company. The company, she admitted privately, was often the noise itself. Clara was 72. 2 years earlier, her husband had died after a long decline that had reshaped their days. During those months, sound had been practical. News in the background while she made phone calls. Music while she cleaned. Anything to keep the air from going still. After the loss, the habit remained. In the first year alone, Clara learned how quiet can feel like a presence. It sits in corners. It waits in hallways. It rises at night when lights are off. She fought it by filling every gap. She stayed busy. She stayed distracted. She stayed tired. One evening in late autumn, a storm passed through and cut the power for a few hours. The house went dark. The familiar devices went silent. Clara lit a candle and placed it on the kitchen table. The flame moved slightly with the draft, and the small movement was enough to hold her attention. Without the television, she could hear the house itself, a faint creak, the refrigerator settling into stillness, rain brushing the windows. The sounds were ordinary. Still, they made her feel exposed, as if the quiet might reveal something she had been avoiding. She sat at the table and let herself feel the discomfort without reaching for an escape. The discomfort was not danger. It was grief, still present, still moving through her like weather. Grief had not ended. It had simply changed shape. Clara realized that the noise had been doing more than keeping her company. It had been keeping her from remembering the calm days before illness arrived, remembering the good parts of the life they built, remembering the tenderness that still lived under the ache. As the storm continued outside, she held her hands around a warm mug of tea. The warmth moved into her fingers. She watched the candle flame and noticed how it made the room softer. In the soft light, the kitchen looked less like a workplace and more like a shelter. When the power returned, the lights snapped on with their familiar brightness. Clara stood and turned them off again. She left the candle and one lamp. The decision felt simple. It also felt like a change in how she wanted to live. In the days that followed, she began allowing the house to have longer, quiet stretches. She still listened to music sometimes. She still enjoyed a familiar voice in the background. The difference was that she did not fear silence as if it were empty. One afternoon, she sat by a window and watched wind move through the branches of a bare tree. The scene held no story, no explanation, no outcome. It was simply the world moving. Clara felt her chest loosen. The quiet did not erase the loss. It gave the loss room to settle. Letting go, for Clara, meant releasing the belief that she needed to outrun grief. She could walk alongside it. She could live with it without letting it rule every room. In that gentler pace, peace began to return, not as a replacement, but as a companion to what had been loved. She began a new routine in the evening. After dinner, she rinsed the dishes and left them to dry. She did not turn on the television immediately. She sat for 10 minutes in a chair near the lamp. Sometimes she folded a towel. Sometimes she simply watched the room. The practice was small. The smallness was what made it possible. At first, memories arrived quickly. A shared laugh. The sound of a familiar step in the hallway. A hand resting briefly on her shoulder as he walked past. The memories brought a tightness, then a softness. Clara noticed that the body can carry both at once. The tightness did not mean failure. The softness did not mean forgetting. On a weekend morning, she opened a drawer and found a stack of old recipe cards in her husband's handwriting. The ink had faded in places. She held one card and traced the letters with her finger. She chose a simple recipe and cooked it slowly, letting the smells fill the house. The smell did not bring him back. It brought the life they shared into the present for a few minutes, and that felt enough. Later, she washed the pan and set it on the rack. The house was quiet again. The quiet did not feel like a hole. It felt like space where love could still exist without needing noise to cover it. She kept the space and let the day move gently forward. At 56, Kenneth began noticing that his body no longer responded to pressure the way it once had. In earlier years, pressure could be useful. A deadline would arrive, and he would tighten his focus, push through, and feel proud afterward. He was used to the idea that effort could solve most things. Now the body asked for something different. It asked for recovery. It asked for sleep that could not be borrowed. It asked for quieter mornings. Kenneth found this inconvenient. He treated it like a flaw he could correct with more discipline. He started waking earlier to fit in more. He added tasks. He tried to keep the same pace he had kept in his 40s. The result was predictable. He grew more tired. His mood became sharper. His patience thinned. He could feel himself becoming less kind, not because he wanted to be, but because his attention was drained. One afternoon, he returned home after a busy day and stood at the kitchen counter, unable to decide what to do next. The list in his mind felt full and slippery. He could not hold it. His hands rested on the counter. He stared at the grain in the wood. The stillness was forced at first. Then it became a pause. Kenneth turned off the overhead light and left a lamp on. The softer light made the room calmer. He sat at the table and drank water slowly, noticing the simple relief of not rushing. The relief embarrassed him slightly. He had spent years believing that slowing down meant failing. In the quiet, he remembered a scene from childhood, an older relative sitting on a porch at dusk, doing nothing that looked productive. Back then, Kenneth had assumed the sitting was laziness. Now he understood it as wisdom. The sitting was the recognition that life is not meant to be a constant sprint. Over the following weeks, Kenneth began changing his pace in small, practical ways. He stopped stacking tasks into the early morning. He left open space between obligations. He took short walks without turning them into fitness goals. He ate meals at a table instead of standing. He let an email wait. The changes did not make him passive. They made him steadier. He noticed that his patience returned when his body was not constantly pushed past its limits. He noticed that small annoyances felt smaller. He noticed that he could listen more fully without thinking about what needed to happen next. One evening, he sat outside for a few minutes as the sky darkened. The air was cool. A few porch lights turned on. The day's noise drained away. Kenneth felt a simple gratitude that did not depend on achievement. Letting go, for Kenneth, meant releasing the belief that every stage of life should be lived at the same speed. It meant accepting that peace is not earned only through effort. Peace is often earned through restraint, through choosing what to stop doing, through allowing the body and mind to live within a pace that can be sustained. In that steadier pace, he began to feel the older years as something other than decline. He began to feel them as a narrowing toward what matters. Fewer distractions, fewer performances, more quiet competence, more time lived without the constant need to prove anything. On a Saturday, he cleaned the garage and found an old tool he had not used in years. It was a small handplane with a worn wooden handle. In earlier years, he would have dismissed it as outdated. Now he held it and felt the smoothness where another hand had gripped it repeatedly. The tool suggested a slower kind of work, a kind that values patience over speed. He brought a scrap piece of wood to a small workbench and ran the plane along it in a steady motion. Thin curls of wood rose and fell like paper. The sound was soft. The action required attention, but not strain. Kenneth felt his mind quiet as he watched the surface become smoother. The task held no deadline. It held only the pleasure of doing one thing at a time. Later, he swept the curls into a small pile and threw them away. The garage still looked ordinary. The difference was in him. He felt as if his attention had been rinsed clean. That evening he cooked a simple meal and ate it slowly. He washed the dishes and left the kitchen light low. He sat in a chair with a book and read until his eyes grew heavy. When he set the book down, he did not reach for a screen. He simply let the room be dim and quiet. In bed, he noticed that sleep arrived without the usual wrestling. The day had not been packed. The day had been lived. The older body, so often treated like an obstacle, responded with gratitude when it was not pushed. Kenneth did not become a different person. He still cared about doing things well. He still valued effort. The change was that effort no longer needed to be constant. Some effort could be released. Some striving could be put down. In what remained, he found a simpler kind of pain. Mara kept a drawer in her kitchen that would not close all the way. It was shallow and crowded with rubber bands, spare keys, folded menus, and slips of paper that had once felt urgent. Each time she forced the drawer shut, she felt a small flash of irritation, as if the house were resisting her. Mara was 61. Her friends described her as organized, and in many ways she was. Bills were paid on time. Appointments were remembered. The car was rarely low on fuel. Still, there were corners of her life that stayed unfinished, and those corners followed her like a faint sound she could never fully locate. In the quiet parts of a day, her mind drifted toward what remained undone, a stack of mail she meant to file, a call she had postponed, a closet shelf that needed sorting. Nothing was catastrophic. Yet the unfinished things created a low pressure, the feeling of living beneath a ceiling that was always slightly too low. On a cold afternoon, she opened the stubborn drawer and pulled everything onto the table. The pile looked small and ordinary. It should have taken minutes. Even so, her shoulders tightened while she stared at it, as if the mess were evidence of something personal. She sorted slowly. Paper went into the bin. Useful items went into a small bowl. A few things she kept for no clear reason, then set down again and released. When the drawer was empty, she wiped the inside with a damp cloth and watched the clean wood appear. She put back only what belonged and let the rest go. The drawer closed with a quiet glide. The sound should have felt like victory. Instead, Mara felt a strange wave of sadness. The sadness was not about a drawer. It was about the years she had spent believing that peace could only arrive after everything was settled. She sat at the table and noticed how quickly her mind moved on to the next item, the next drawer, the next list, the next repair. The pattern seemed endless. Even if she tidied every room, another day would arrive with more to handle. A life cannot be completed the way a checklist can be completed. That evening, she opened her planner and looked at her usual blocks of tasks. She crossed out 2 items without replacing them. The blank spaces made her uneasy. The unease was familiar. It was the feeling that stillness must be justified. Mara made tea and drank it at the table without doing anything else. She let the warm mug rest in her hands and listened to the quiet in the house. The quiet did not accuse her. It did not demand a reason. It simply existed, waiting for her to stop treating rest like something that must be earned. Over the next week, she practiced leaving a few things undone on purpose. A pan could soak overnight. Laundry could stay in a basket for a day. The world did not punish her for it. The small imperfections did not expand into chaos. They remained what they were, minor signs of living. In that small release, Mara noticed something she had been missing. Sunlight shifting across the floor. The comfort of a chair near the window. The satisfaction of ending a day without racing to finish it. Order still mattered to her, but it no longer needed to be a moral test. The drawer remained smooth and quiet. It was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a reminder that letting go can be practical, a small act, a clean boundary between what needs attention and what can wait. In that boundary, peace found room to settle. On Saturday morning, her sister stopped by with a bag of pastries and a story about a small household disaster. The story was told with humor, but beneath it was the familiar request for rescue. Mara listened, nodded, and felt the old reflex to take over. She pictured herself driving across town, buying supplies, reorganizing another person's cabinet the way she organized her own. Instead, she asked a few simple questions and offered one small suggestion. Then she let the silence sit for a moment. Her sister looked surprised, then began talking through the problem on her own. The solution appeared in the space where Mara usually filled every gap. After her sister left, Mara noticed that her body felt lighter. She had not withdrawn love. She had simply stopped turning love into labor. The kitchen stayed quiet. The drawer stayed closed. The day remained her own for a few hours, and the ownership felt calm rather than selfish. By late afternoon, she took a short walk and returned home without adding anything to the list. She washed a cup and left it on the rack. She sat down with a book and read until her eyes grew tired. The house was not perfect. It was peaceful, and that was enough. Leon had a habit of explaining himself. If he declined an invitation, he offered a full reason. If he changed a plan, he apologized twice. If he arrived late, he described every delay as if a simple sentence could not be trusted to stand on its own. Leon was 53. He learned early that approval can feel like safety, and he carried that lesson into adulthood. His words became cushions. He padded his choices so no one would feel disappointed, and so he would not need to feel the sting of being disliked. On a weekday morning, an acquaintance sent a message asking for help with a complicated task. Leon read the request and felt the familiar twist in his stomach. His first impulse was to agree. His second impulse was to begin constructing an explanation for why he might later need to back out. The mind moved quickly toward protection, even before a decision was made. He typed a response and deleted it. He typed again and deleted again. Each draft grew longer. Each draft tried to manage the other person's emotions. Leon noticed how much energy the managing required, and he felt tired before he even answered. He wrote a new response. It was short. He said he could not help with this. He did not add an excuse. He did not apologize. He read the sentence 3 times, feeling exposed by its simplicity, then pressed send. A minute later, the discomfort arrived. It felt like guilt, but it was not guilt about refusing. It was fear of being judged. Leon listened to that fear without feeding it. The fear wanted him to reopen the message and soften it. He left it alone. An hour passed. A reply arrived. It was brief and polite. It accepted the refusal and moved on. Leon stared at the screen and felt a small shock at how much drama his mind had invented. Nothing had happened. The world had continued. Later that evening, his partner asked why he seemed lighter. Leon hesitated, then described the message he had sent. He expected criticism, or at least a reminder to be careful. Instead, his partner listened and said the short refusal sounded respectful. The word landed quietly. Respectful had never been the label Leon used for his boundaries. He usually called them selfish. He remembered a childhood dinner table where questions came with traps. A wrong answer could be met with sarcasm or silence. Leon learned to speak with extra qualifiers, to anticipate reactions before they arrived. The habit became so old that it felt like his personality rather than his protection. Over the next week, Leon practiced saying less. He kept his tone warm, but he removed the extra scaffolding. He noticed how often his explanations were not information, but a plea. They were a quiet request for permission to exist without upsetting anyone. A few people reacted with slight surprise when he did not over-explain. Some asked follow-up questions and he answered simply. Others accepted the first response and moved on. Leon noticed that the people who demanded elaborate justifications were often the people who benefited from his uncertainty. He did not become blunt. He became calm. When he could not do something, he said so. When he needed time, he took time. The world adjusted in small ways, and he adjusted with it. One weekend, he and his partner took a slow drive with no errands attached. They stopped at a small shop and shared a pastry on a bench. Leon spoke less than usual and listened more. The quiet between sentences felt comfortable instead of dangerous. In that comfort, he sensed what letting go looked like for him. It was releasing the belief that every boundary required a courtroom argument. It was allowing a simple statement to be enough. One afternoon, he met his neighbor in the hallway. The neighbor made a casual request for a small favor. Leon heard his old reflex begin to build an explanation, then stopped. He gave a clear answer and left it there. The neighbor nodded, thanked him, and continued down the stairs. The simplicity of the exchange felt almost unreal, as if Leon had been expecting a hidden test that never existed. That night he sat at the kitchen table while his partner read nearby. The room was dim, the kind of dim that makes a house feel gentle. Leon noticed that he was not replaying the day's conversations. He was not drafting follow-up messages in his head. He was simply present in the quiet. He realized that much of his fatigue had come from treating every interaction like a negotiation for acceptance. Letting go did not mean becoming careless with people. It meant trusting that a calm no could be kind, and that a short sentence could carry the full weight of a decision without collapsing. Paula once loved planning. In her 30s, she could turn a weekend into a neat sequence of errands, meals, visits, and chores. The planning made life feel manageable. It also made life feel safe, as if a clean calendar could keep uncertainty away. Paula was 64 now. The habit of planning remained, but the pleasure had faded. Her calendar was crowded with obligations she no longer remembered agreeing to. She moved from one item to the next with a steady face and a tired body. Even pleasant plans began to feel like demands. On a Tuesday morning, she stood in her kitchen holding a list for the day and felt a quiet surge of resentment. The list was not unreasonable. Still, it felt like a leash. She wanted a day that could breathe, a day that did not require constant performance. Paula sat down with her calendar and looked at it with a calmer eye. She noticed that many entries were not necessities. They were habits. They were commitments made years ago that had never been questioned. They were favors that had become routine. They were gatherings attended out of duty rather than desire. She crossed out 2 items and left the spaces blank. The blank spaces made her uneasy. The unease carried a familiar voice. If the calendar is not full, life must be empty. If the calendar is not full, a person might be forgotten. Paula recognized the voice as old. It belonged to a younger version of her who believed visibility was security. The older version wanted something steadier. It wanted a quieter life with fewer obligations and more honest attention. That week, she declined an invitation with a simple sentence. She did not apologize. She did not offer a long reason. She stayed home and made soup, letting the house remain quiet. In the afternoon, she sat near a window and watched light move across the floor. The calm that arrived felt unfamiliar, then it felt like relief. On Saturday, she met her friend Lila for coffee, a friend who did not require constant proof of loyalty. They sat in a small place with warm mugs and slow conversation. Paula admitted that she was tired of rushing. Lila nodded and said the tiredness made sense. There was no debate, no pressure to justify, only understanding. Over the next month, Paula began protecting one day each week from extra commitments. She took walks without turning them into errands. She read for an hour without glancing at the clock. She cooked meals slowly. She allowed the house to be lived in without trying to keep it perfect. Some people reacted with surprise. A few hinted that she was becoming less available. Paula listened without defending herself. She let the discomfort pass. She noticed that the people who cared for her as a person adjusted quickly. The people who relied on her availability adjusted more slowly. As the calendar emptied a little, her body softened. Sleep came more easily, her jaw unclenched. Mornings felt less like a race. She began waking with a sense of open space ahead of her, and the space felt like kindness. One Sunday evening, she sat on her porch with a blanket over her legs. The sky was pale and quiet. The neighborhood sounds were gentle. The day offered no special event. It offered rest, and the rest felt full. Letting go, for Paula, was releasing the belief that a full calendar proves a full life. A life can be rich without being crowded. A person can be loved without being constantly present. In the space that remained, peace had room to arrive and stay. Later in the week, a community group she had supported for years asked her to take on a small organizing role again. Paula felt the old reflex to say yes before the sentence was fully formed. She paused and asked who else might be able to do it. The question felt strange. The group had grown used to her reliability, and she had grown used to being the one who carried the details. A younger member offered to step in. The offer came with a little uncertainty, but it was real. Paula agreed and watched herself resist the urge to supervise. She let the younger member handle the messages, the reminders, the small decisions. A few things were done differently than Paula would have done them. Nothing was harmed. That night, Paula realized that much of her busyness had been a way to avoid feeling replaceable. The fear of being replaced had pushed her into constant usefulness. Letting go did not make her less important. It made her less burdened. It allowed others to grow, and it allowed her to rest without guilt. In the following days, she noticed that even her breathing changed when she stopped treating every hour like proof. The quiet spaces were no longer empty. They were hers. Dennis kept an old set of tools in his garage, even after he stopped doing most repairs himself. The tools hung on a pegboard in careful rows, polished and rarely used. Sometimes he stood there and looked at them as if they were evidence of who he used to be. Dennis was 70. In his earlier years, he could fix almost anything with time and patience. He had been proud of that, not in a loud way, but with the quiet satisfaction of competence. As the years passed, his hands grew less steady. His knees complained sooner. Tasks that once felt easy began to require more effort than they were worth. A leaking faucet appeared one winter. Dennis tried to handle it alone, stubbornly, in the way he always had. He crouched under the sink and felt his back tighten. The small bolts seemed harder to grip. He worked for an hour and made little progress. Finally, he called his son, asking for a hand without saying how much it mattered. His son arrived with a calm smile and a small bag of parts. They worked together, shoulder to shoulder in the narrow space. Dennis noticed the ease in his son's movements and felt a tightness in his own chest. The tightness was not envy. It was grief for the simple strength he had once taken for granted. When the faucet was repaired, his son wiped his hands and began talking about an unrelated plan for the weekend. The conversation was ordinary. Dennis listened and realized that his son did not see him as less for needing help. The judgment had been inside Dennis alone. After his son left, Dennis returned to the garage and looked at the pegboard. He noticed how the tools had become more than tools. They had become a story about identity. As long as the tools stayed pristine and ready, he could pretend that the old version of himself was still waiting behind a door. He chose one item he had not used in years and placed it in a box for donation. The act felt oddly heavy, as if he were discarding a memory. He reminded himself that competence does not live in metal. It lives in the years of work that shaped his hands and his mind, and those years were real whether the tools remained or not. Over the next month, he gave away more. He kept a small set that still served him. A hammer with a worn handle, a tape measure, a few screwdrivers. The rest he released. With each release, the garage felt less like a museum and more like a simple space. Dennis began focusing on what he could still do. He could still cook a meal for family. He could still walk slowly on mild days. He could still listen carefully when someone needed to talk. The usefulness had changed shape, but it was not gone. One afternoon, his son brought over a grandchild who wanted to build a small birdhouse. Dennis sat at the workbench while the child held pieces of wood. Together they measured, marked, and fit the parts. Dennis did not do the hard work alone. He guided with patience. The child laughed when a nail went in crooked, then tried again. The birdhouse was imperfect and sturdy. When they finished, Dennis felt a calm warmth that had nothing to do with proving strength. It came from sharing time and attention, and from accepting that the older years are not a contest with the past. Letting go for Dennis meant releasing the belief that worth depends on the same abilities lasting forever. Bodies change, roles change, love remains. In that acceptance, peace began to replace the constant effort to hold on to an earlier self. In the weeks after, Dennis noticed how often he had been tightening against change. When a neighbor offered to carry a heavy bag, he accepted with a quiet thanks. The acceptance felt like a small surrender at first. Then it felt like relief. The neighbor did not treat him as fragile. The neighbor treated him as someone living inside normal limits. Dennis began taking short walks with his friend Harold in the late afternoon. They moved slowly and talked about small things. A new fence going up on the next street. A dog that always waited at the same window. Harold mentioned his own aches without dramatizing them. The honesty made the conversation feel lighter. There was no need to compete with time. One evening, Dennis returned home and sat for a while in the quiet kitchen. The pegboard in the garage was still there, simpler now. He felt a strange gratitude for the life that had been lived and for the life that remained. Letting go had not made him smaller. It had made him less burdened by the need to prove anything to himself. Sophie kept every message. Text threads, emails, old voicemails that should have been deleted years ago. She told herself she liked having records. The truth was that she feared forgetting. Forgetting felt like losing. If she kept the evidence, she believed she could keep the relationships intact. Sophie was 55. Over time, her phone became an archive. She could scroll back and find old jokes, old plans, old apologies. Sometimes she did it on purpose. Often she did it without thinking, as if the past could be revisited to steady the present. One evening she sat on the couch and opened a message thread with someone she no longer spoke to. The messages were ordinary: a shared laugh, a small misunderstanding, a few attempts to repair, then silence. Sophie read them slowly and felt a heaviness rise in her chest. The heaviness was familiar. She had visited it many times. She looked around her living room. It was warm and safe. A lamp cast a soft circle of light on the floor. The heaviness did not belong to the room. It belonged to the habit of reopening what had ended. Sophie set the phone down and stared at her hands. She realized that the scrolling was a form of bargaining. If she could replay the words enough times, perhaps the ending would soften. Perhaps a different meaning would appear. The mind was trying to rewrite time. The next day she practiced a small act of release. She did not delete everything. She did not pretend the relationship never existed. She simply archived the thread and left it there. The act felt minor. Still, her body reacted as if she had stepped away from a cliff edge. Over the next week, the urge to reopen the thread returned like an itch. Sophie noticed the itch and did not scratch it. She made tea. She folded laundry. She took a slow walk in cool air. The urge rose and fell. When she did not feed it, it passed more quickly than she expected. On Saturday, she visited her friend Nina, a friend who had always been steady. They cooked a simple lunch and ate at the table without checking phones. Nina spoke about the quiet happiness of ordinary days. Sophie listened and realized how much time she had spent living in old conversations instead of present ones. That evening, Sophie cleared a handful of notifications and unsubscribed from messages she never read. She deleted a set of old voicemails she had kept out of sentiment. She felt a brief sting while she pressed delete, then a calm after, like a room with fewer objects. She printed a few photographs that mattered and placed them in a small album. She chose images that felt warm rather than sharp. The memories were given a home that did not require constant scrolling. The album went on a shelf, and the shelf felt like a gentle boundary. Letting go, for Sophie, meant allowing certain chapters to stay closed. The love had been real. The ending was also real. Both could exist without being re-examined every week. Peace did not come from erasing the past. It came from letting the past stop interrupting the present. A month later, she noticed something new. When she sat down at night, her hands no longer reached for the old thread automatically. She picked up a book instead. She listened to quiet music. She fell asleep with fewer images looping behind her eyes. The archive was still there, but it no longer ran her evenings. In that quieter space, life began to feel more open. One afternoon, Nina asked what Sophie missed most. Sophie did not answer right away. She stared at the steam rising from her mug and realized she missed the simple sense of being understood without effort. She missed the ease that existed before explanations became necessary. Nina nodded without trying to repair the feeling. The nod was enough. At home, Sophie took out a notebook and wrote a short letter she did not plan to send. It was not a plea and not an accusation. It was a plain acknowledgement of what had mattered and what had ended. When she finished, she folded the page and placed it in a drawer. The letter was not meant to change the past. It was meant to stop the past from demanding constant attention. In the following days, the silence where the scrolling had been felt strange. Sophie filled part of it with small routines. She opened a window and let fresh air move through the room. The routines were quiet, and they helped. She began to notice that memory can be honored without being reopened endlessly. A photograph on a shelf. A small object kept with care. A story remembered once, then released. Letting go did not erase meaning. It allowed meaning to stay gentle instead of sharp. One night, Sophie turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dark room. The phone was charging on the counter, silent. She felt the simple relief of not being pulled backward. The day had ended where it belonged, in the present, and peace came with it. Victor believed worry was preparation. If he worried enough, he told himself he would not be surprised. Over the years, the worry became a constant background hum. It shaped his mornings, his choices, his sleep. It sat beside him at the table like an extra guest. Victor was 63. He had raised children and handled difficult years. He had paid bills, repaired problems, and stayed steady when others panicked. The steadiness looked admirable from the outside. Inside, it often felt like bracing. One morning, he woke early and lay in bed listening to his thoughts run. The thoughts moved from a small health concern to a family worry, to a money worry, to a world worry. None of the worries were new. They were familiar paths. His mind traveled automatically, as if repetition could turn fear into control. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table while the house stayed quiet. He noticed that the worry was not solving anything. It was simply repeating itself. The mind was generating motion to avoid stillness. That day he tried a simple method. When a worry arrived, he wrote it down on paper. He did not argue with it. He did not feed it. He wrote it down and then wrote one action beside it, if an action existed. If no action existed, he left a blank. The list surprised him. Many worries had no action attached. They were noise pretending to be responsibility. The few that did have actions were small and ordinary. Make a call. Schedule an appointment. Check a statement. The actions were finite. The worry had been infinite. Victor handled the small actions in one afternoon. When they were done, he closed the notebook and put it in a drawer. The closing felt unnatural, as if he were leaving a door unlocked. He noticed his body wanted to reopen the notebook immediately and add new fears. He resisted. In the evening, he met his friend Carla for a walk. They moved slowly along a familiar route. Carla spoke about her own habits of catastrophizing and laughed softly at herself. Victor laughed too, then felt his chest loosen. The looseness came from realizing he was not alone in his patterns. At home that night, the worries returned. Victor felt them rise, then reminded himself that the notebook had a time and a place. He did not need to carry every fear into every room. He made tea and sat in a dim lamp glow until the urges softened. Over the next week, he limited worry to a short window in the late afternoon. He sat with the notebook for 10 minutes, wrote what appeared, noted any real actions, then closed it again. When worry tried to return later, he told himself it had already been heard. The change was gradual. Sleep improved first. Then his mood softened. He became less reactive. He began enjoying small daily pleasures without scanning for danger. A good cup of coffee, a quiet house, a simple conversation that did not need to turn into a forecast of what might break. Letting go, for Victor, meant releasing the belief that worry is love. Love can be attentive without being anxious. Responsibility can exist without constant alarm. Peace did not make him careless. Peace made him present, and presence gave him more strength than worry ever had. One Saturday, his daughter called with a small problem at her apartment. Victor felt the familiar rush to imagine every possible outcome. He pictured leaks, expenses, injuries, long drives. While she spoke, he noticed how quickly his mind turned a small request into a storm. He paused, asked one clear question, then listened to her answer. The problem became what it actually was: a simple fix and a short visit from a maintenance person. After the call, Victor sat in his chair and let his shoulders drop. He realized that worry had been stealing his ability to listen. It filled the space where simple attention could have been. He had been trying to protect the people he loved, but the protection often turned into tension shared through his tone and his urgency. That evening, his partner set a hand on his arm and asked if he wanted to watch a movie. Victor almost said he had too much on his mind, the usual phrase that made worry sound noble. Instead, he agreed. They watched a quiet film and ate popcorn from a bowl between them. For 90 minutes, the day remained simple. Later, lying in bed, Victor noticed that his body felt different when it was not braced. The absence of alarm was not emptiness. It was space. In that space, he could sense the ordinary steadiness of his life, the parts that were already held together. The next week, when worry returned, he wrote it down and gave it a place. He did not demand that it vanish. He simply refused to let it govern every hour. The notebook in the drawer became a boundary. The boundary became a kind of peace. Hannah carried a quiet resentment toward her younger self. She did not speak about it aloud. It lived in small comments she made in her head when she made a mistake or felt tired. She believed she should have chosen better years ago. She believed she should have known more sooner. Hannah was 60. She had built a decent life, steady work, a small home, a few friendships that mattered. Still, she looked backward with a sharp lens. She could list wrong turns easily. She could list days she wasted. The harshness felt like honesty. It was also a kind of punishment that never ended. One afternoon, she found an old notebook in a kitchen drawer. The pages held plans she had written 20 years earlier. Career goals, health goals, a list of books she meant to read, notes about the person she hoped to become. The handwriting looked younger, tighter, hopeful. Hannah read the pages and felt a tenderness she did not expect. The plans were imperfect. Some were naive. Still, the voice in the notebook was trying. It was trying to build a life with the information available at the time. She realized she had been judging the past with knowledge the past did not possess. She had been asking a younger mind to act with an older wisdom. The demand was unfair. The demand was also useless. It did not change anything. It only kept her tense. That evening, she called her friend Renee, the kind of friend who could sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it. Hannah mentioned the notebook and the familiar shame she carried. Renee listened and said softly that most people survive by improvisation. The sentence felt simple and true. After the call, Hannah sat quietly and practiced a different kind of remembering. She remembered not only mistakes, but effort. She remembered showing up to work when she was scared. She remembered keeping promises to people who mattered. She remembered small acts of courage that had never made a dramatic story. Over the next week, she noticed the old habit of self-attack and began interrupting it. She did not replace it with praise. She replaced it with fairness. The younger self had done what it could. The younger self had not been lazy. The younger self had been learning. On Sunday, she visited her sister and helped make dinner. They chopped vegetables side by side, talking about ordinary things. Hannah noticed a small warmth in the scene. This, too, was part of her life. A steady, connected moment that did not require perfection. It existed because she had kept going. Later, alone in her living room, she looked again at the notebook. She did not tear it up. She did not keep it as an accusation. She placed it on a shelf, not as proof of failure, but as proof of a long, ongoing attempt. Letting go for Hannah meant releasing self-punishment. It meant allowing growth to be slow and uneven. Peace arrived not through rewriting the past, but through forgiving a life that had already happened and turning attention toward what remained. The next morning, she made coffee and sat near the window as daylight grew. The old regrets did not vanish. They softened. They became background, not a verdict. The day ahead felt quieter, and the quiet felt like a place she could live. That night, she wrote a short list of what her younger self had carried. A job that paid the bills. A family that needed help. A body that was often tired. A mind that wanted certainty and could not find it. Seeing the list in plain words changed the story. The story became human rather than defective. Renee came over the following weekend with a loaf of bread and a small bouquet of grocery store flowers. They sat at the table and talked about how years pass faster than expected. Renee mentioned her own old decisions with a gentle shrug. The shrug held a kind of wisdom. There is no perfect past. There is only the past that happened. When Renee left, Hannah washed the dishes and noticed that she was not criticizing herself for moving slowly. She was simply moving. The water was warm. The plates were ordinary. The moment did not need to be improved to be worth living. Letting go, for Hannah, was learning to stop using memory as a weapon. It was allowing the older years to be guided by compassion instead of a running tally of mistakes. In that shift, peace began to feel less like an achievement and more like a daily permission. Before bed, Hannah opened the notebook one more time and read a single hopeful line she had written long ago. She closed it gently and set it back on the shelf. The gesture felt like a quiet reconciliation, a way of saying the past could rest now. Calvin kept options open. He delayed decisions until the last possible moment, as if choosing one path would close doors forever. He told himself he was flexible. The truth was that he feared making the wrong choice. And the fear turned ordinary decisions into long debates. Calvin was 52. He could adapt quickly when life forced his hand. He could handle surprises. Yet his own choices felt heavier than they needed to be. He treated a simple commitment like a permanent contract, and the constant postponing left him restless. He noticed it most on weekends. Friday would arrive, and instead of feeling relief, he felt pressure to use the time correctly. He scanned possibilities: a visit, a project, a long walk, rest. Each option became a competing voice, and the voices made it hard to settle into any one thing. One afternoon, he sat at his desk staring at a decision he had been postponing for months. It was not dramatic. It was a small commitment to a routine and a modest personal project. Still, he treated it as if it carried life-altering consequences. Calvin realized that indecision had become its own decision. It was deciding to stay stuck. It was deciding to keep living with low-grade anxiety rather than accept the normal risk of choosing. He made the commitment that day. He wrote it down and set a start date. The moment after committing, fear rose in his chest. Then, surprisingly, relief arrived. The relief came from stopping the endless internal debate. That week, he practiced smaller commitments. He planned a morning and followed it. He chose one activity and allowed himself to enjoy it without constantly imagining alternatives. When he felt the urge to switch plans, he paused and reminded himself that every choice contains trade-offs, and trade-offs are part of living. On Thursday, he had dinner with his friend Omar. They met at a simple place and ate slowly. Omar mentioned a decision he had made years ago that turned out imperfect, then shrugged. The shrug held a kind of calm. Life keeps moving. A person adjusts. The world does not require perfect foresight. After dinner, Calvin walked home and noticed the evening air. He realized how rarely he noticed it when his mind was busy calculating. The air was cool and clear. The streetlights made soft pools of light on the pavement. The moment felt quiet and complete. Over the next month, Calvin began committing to his small project in steady blocks of time. He did not judge the pace. He showed up and worked, then stopped. The stopping mattered. It taught his mind that effort does not need to expand until it consumes everything. He also committed to rest without bargaining. He sat in a chair with a book and did not treat the hour as stolen. He took a nap when he was tired. The rest felt unfamiliar at first. Then it felt like something he had been missing. Letting go for Calvin was releasing the illusion that a perfect choice exists. Peace came not from certainty, but from living with reasonable uncertainty without needing to constantly adjust. In the steadiness of chosen days, he felt something simple, a life actually being lived, not endlessly evaluated from the doorway. One Saturday, his sister invited him to join a family gathering on short notice. Calvin's mind immediately began weighing the social comfort of attending against the quiet pull of staying home. In the past, he might have hovered in indecision until the day was half gone. This time he chose. He said yes, then put the phone down. At the gathering, he felt the familiar discomfort of small talk, but he stayed. He helped carry trays to the table. He listened to an older uncle describe a hobby in careful detail. The conversation was not thrilling. It was human. When Calvin stopped asking whether he should be somewhere else, he noticed the small warmth of being included. Later, at home, he worked for an hour on his project and then closed the notebook. The old urge returned, the urge to check other possibilities, to look for a better use of time. He sat with the urge and watched it pass. In the following week, he began making decisions earlier in the day on purpose. He chose dinner plans by noon. He chose a time to walk and took the walk. He chose one task for the evening and did not add 5 more. The simplicity created a new kind of calm. Omar noticed the change and smiled when Calvin declined an extra commitment without apologizing. The smile was small, but it mattered. It suggested that clarity could be respectable. It suggested that saying yes to one thing is also saying no to noise. Letting go for Calvin was not abandoning ambition. It was abandoning the constant hovering. It was allowing life to have a shape, even if the shape was imperfect. In that shape, peace did not need to be searched for. It was already present in the minutes he had stopped bargaining away. Irene used to be proud of how much she could carry. She carried family responsibilities, work demands, and friends' needs with steady competence. She rarely complained. She rarely asked for help. She believed strength was proven by how little she required from others. Irene was 65 now. The carrying had left quiet marks. Not dramatic ones, but persistent ones. Fatigue that did not fully lift after sleep. Patience that ran out sooner. A sense sometimes that she was living with a heavy pack she could no longer pretend was light. She noticed it one morning when she stood in the kitchen looking at her day. A neighbor needed a ride. A friend wanted help sorting papers. A relative expected her to handle a family detail. None of the requests were cruel. Together they formed a life where Irene's time belonged to everyone else first. That afternoon she visited her friend Marisol, who had simplified her days after a health scare. Marisol's house was calm, not empty, but uncluttered. The conversation was unhurried. Marisol spoke about the peace of doing fewer things well. Irene listened and felt a mix of admiration and resentment. The resentment was not toward Marisol. It was toward herself. Driving home, Irene realized how much of her identity had been built around endurance. Endurance can be noble. It can also become a trap. It can keep a person in patterns that no longer serve, long after the patterns stop being necessary. That evening, she made a list of what she was carrying that no one had asked her to carry. The list surprised her. Some items were habits. Some were assumptions. Some were emotional responsibilities that belonged to other adults. She chose one obligation to set down. It was small, a routine favor she had been doing out of reflex. She called the person involved and said she would not be doing it anymore. Her voice stayed calm, but her hands shook while she spoke. The shaking was the body releasing an old rule. The next day, nothing terrible happened. The person adjusted. Another person stepped in. Irene felt a sharp relief, followed by a strange emptiness. The emptiness was the space where constant usefulness had been. The space felt uncomfortable at first. Then it began to feel like rest. On the weekend, she met Marisol for a walk. They moved slowly and talked about ordinary things. Marisol mentioned how often people confuse being needed with being loved. Irene felt the sentence land and sit. Over the next month, Irene set down one small burden at a time. Some people adjusted easily. Others pushed back. The pushback clarified what had been dependent and what had been genuine. Irene did not argue. She simply continued. As her load lightened, her body responded. She moved more easily. Sleep improved. She laughed more. She began taking small pleasures seriously, not as indulgences, but as nourishment. Coffee in a quiet kitchen, a clean bed, a morning with no demands. Letting go, for Irene, did not mean becoming selfish. It meant becoming sustainable. It meant recognizing that peace requires limits. A person can care deeply without carrying everything. In the lighter days that followed, she began to feel something she had not felt in years. Enoughness. One week, her brother called with a familiar tone, the tone that assumed she would handle a family coordination task. Irene listened, then said she could not. The pause on the line felt long. Her brother asked why. Irene gave a simple answer and did not expand it into a story. The simplicity felt daring. It also felt clean. After the call, she noticed the urge to explain more, to soften the boundary until it disappeared. She let the urge pass. She made lunch and ate it without rushing. The day remained intact. Later that month, her niece invited her to spend an afternoon together, not for help, but for company. They walked through a small market and looked at jars of honey and stacks of bread. Irene realized how rare it had become to be invited simply to be present. She accepted, and the afternoon felt gentle. At home that night, she opened a drawer of old appointment cards and papers she had been keeping for no reason. She threw away what no longer mattered. The cleaning was not urgent. It was symbolic. It was a way of saying the old habit of carrying everything could be released in small pieces. In the following weeks, Irene noticed that she had more patience for the people she loved when she was not depleted by everyone else. Her kindness became less brittle. Her attention became steadier. Letting go had not made her colder. It had made her more available in the ways that mattered. Simon carried old arguments in his mind, not because he enjoyed conflict, but because he wanted closure. He believed that if he thought long enough, he would find the perfect explanation that would make everything fair. The explanations never arrived. The thinking continued. Simon was 57. In daily life, he was calm and courteous. Inside, he kept a private courtroom where past conversations were replayed and corrected. He wanted the other person to understand. He wanted the past to be revised. He wanted a final verdict that would allow him to rest. One afternoon, he walked through a small museum and paused in front of a quiet landscape painting. The scene was ordinary. A stretch of field, a pale sky, a line of trees. The painting held calm without trying to fix anything. Simon stood there longer than he expected. The silence of the image felt like a different way of living. On the drive home, he noticed the same pattern repeating in his thoughts. A familiar argument that had happened years earlier with a former colleague. The colleague had been unfair. Simon had never received an apology. His mind kept returning to the moment, trying to craft a better response. That night, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote down the grievance in plain sentences. He wrote what happened. He wrote what he wanted to happen instead. Then he wrote what could be done now. The present offered very little action. The main action was acceptance. Acceptance sounded like surrender. Simon felt resistance rise. He realized he had been surrendering already for years, surrendering attention, sleep, and calm to an argument that could not be reopened. Acceptance was not surrender. It was release. The next day, he met his friend Elaine for lunch. Elaine listened as he described the mental replaying. She said, quietly, that the mind often demands an apology from a person who no longer matters, simply because the mind does not like loose ends. The sentence felt true. It also felt sad. Over the next week, whenever the old argument returned, Simon practiced a simple phrase in his mind. The phrase was plain. The past is finished. The phrase did not erase emotion. It stopped emotion from becoming a loop. He noticed the effect in small moments. He could wash dishes without hearing the old conversation. He could drive without rehearsing a different ending. He could read a page without returning to the same angry paragraph in his head. One evening, he sat in a chair near a lamp while rain tapped lightly on a window. The house settled with small sounds. Simon realized that closure is not always granted by other people. Sometimes closure is chosen internally by setting down the need to win a case that no longer has a courtroom. Letting go, for Simon, meant allowing unfairness to remain unresolved. It meant accepting that life includes unbalanced moments that never receive correction. The acceptance did not make him weak. It made him free to return attention to the day that was actually here, and the day felt calmer when it no longer had to compete with an old fight. On Saturday morning, the argument returned while he was folding laundry. The memory arrived with sharp clarity, the tone of voice, the room, the moment of being dismissed. Simon felt his jaw tighten. He noticed the tightening and paused. He took a slow breath and returned to the phrase. The past is finished. He folded the next shirt as if he were teaching his hands to stay in the present. He tried a second practice. He wrote a short note on a scrap of paper, a single sentence that named what he had wanted. Respect. He placed the scrap in a drawer. The sentence was not for anyone else. It was for him, a way of acknowledging the need without turning it into a campaign. Later that day, his partner asked why he seemed quieter than usual. Simon described the old replaying and the new experiment of letting it rest. His partner listened and said some people never apologize because they do not understand what they did. The statement did not excuse the harm. It simply explained why waiting for an apology can become an endless wait. The next week, Simon returned to the museum. He stood again in front of the landscape painting. He noticed how little the painting demanded from him. It did not ask him to win. It did not ask him to correct. It asked him only to look. Simon felt his shoulders lower. Driving home, he realized that his mind had been trying to restore dignity by winning imaginary arguments. Dignity can also be restored by refusing to keep living in the moment of insult. The refusal is quiet. It is not dramatic. It is the decision to stop paying rent to a past that cannot change. That evening, he made dinner, ate slowly, and washed the dishes. The old case tried to reappear, then faded. The quiet that remained was not emptiness. It was space, and in that space the day felt calm. Evelyn kept a small box in the back of a closet, the kind of box that travels from house to house without ever being opened. Inside were letters, a few faded photographs, and a thin bracelet she had not worn in decades. The box was not heavy, but it held a weight that never quite left her. Evelyn was 72. Her life was stable and ordinary, filled with routines that suited her. Still, she carried a private habit of revisiting a version of life that did not happen. It was not dramatic longing. It was a quiet checking, as if she might still find proof that the old path could have worked. One winter afternoon, she pulled the box down and sat at the dining table. She opened it slowly, as though the air inside might be fragile. A letter lay on top, written by a friend from her 20s. The letter described a plan that never became real, a move to another city, a shared apartment, a new beginning. Evelyn read the lines and felt a familiar ache rise, then settle. She noticed that the ache was not only sadness, it was also a kind of loyalty. She had kept the letter because it represented a self she once believed she would become. Keeping it felt like keeping faith with that younger person. Evelyn placed the letter on the table and looked around the room. The room held evidence of a different life, one that had been lived fully in its own way. Family photos on the wall, a small stack of books beside her chair, a worn blanket folded neatly over a sofa arm. The life in the room was real, present, and steady. She realized that the box had become a doorway she kept stepping through. Each visit returned her to a question that could never be answered. What if? The question sounded harmless, but it softened her attention to what was already here. Evelyn chose 2 items from the box to keep in a simpler form. She placed a photograph in a small frame. She folded the letter and put it into a plain envelope with a date written lightly on the front. The rest she returned to the box without rereading. She closed the lid and felt a small tremor of reluctance, then a quieter relief. The relief surprised her. She had expected guilt. Instead, she felt how tiring it was to keep holding an old possibility open. Possibility has its season. When the season passes, holding it too tightly can become a form of refusal. That evening, her grandson visited and asked for help with a school project. Evelyn spread papers across the table and listened while he explained what he needed. His voice was quick and earnest. She helped him organize the steps and watched him gain confidence as he worked. The present felt warm and immediate, not as a distraction from the past, but as a real place to stand. After he left, Evelyn returned the box to the closet. She did not make a dramatic decision to purge it forever. She simply stopped treating it like a portal that needed regular travel. Letting go, for her, meant allowing the unlived life to become a quiet memory rather than an open door. In that gentle closing, peace arrived with less effort. A few days later, she met her friend Ruth for tea. Ruth spoke about downsizing and the strange emotions that come with sorting old things. Evelyn listened and felt the temptation to explain her own box in detail to justify why she kept it. She said very little instead. She noticed that her friend did not require a story. Ruth simply nodded, as if understanding did not depend on full disclosure. Walking home, Evelyn watched snow gather along the edges of sidewalks. The world looked quiet and unfinished, and it did not seem anxious about it. The branches held their bare shape without apology. The season did not argue for itself. It simply was. At home, Evelyn sat by the window with a small lamp on and let the evening settle. She felt the old question rise once, then pass. In its place came a softer thought. A life is not a single path chosen correctly. A life is a series of days lived with whatever is available in those days. She looked at the framed photograph she had set out. In it, she was young, laughing, squinting into sunlight. The image did not accuse her of anything. It did not demand that she return and finish the old plan. It simply reminded her that joy had existed, and that joy could exist again in different forms. When she went to bed, she did not feel the need to rehearse what might have been. The room was dark and calm. The closet stayed closed. The peace she felt was not erasure. It was permission to stop keeping vigil over a future that had already passed. Gordon kept a small notebook beside his bed, a habit he had started when his work was demanding. He once used it for tasks and reminders. In retirement, the notebook filled with a different kind of list: regrets, resentments, and small unfinished conversations that returned at night. Gordon was 68. During the day, he looked relaxed, even cheerful. At night, his mind acted like a clerk sorting old files. He replayed moments where he should have spoken up. He replayed moments where he spoke too sharply. The old scenes carried a charge that felt out of proportion, as if his sleep depended on reaching the correct conclusion. One night, he woke at 2 and stared at the ceiling, listening to the internal noise. He reached for the notebook and began writing. Instead of recording the full story, he wrote only the simplest facts. A meeting, a sentence, a feeling of being overlooked. He noticed how quickly the mind tried to add arguments and motives. He resisted. He stayed with plain description. When he finished, the page looked small and almost silly. Still, he felt his chest loosen. The act of naming the thought without feeding it changed the texture of the worry. It became an object on paper rather than a loop in his body. The next morning, he met his neighbor Frank at the mailbox. Frank asked how retirement was going, then laughed and said his own mind had become louder since he stopped working. The admission was casual, the kind of honesty that makes a person feel less alone. Gordon nodded and felt a quiet relief. The problem was not unique. It was human. That afternoon, Gordon sat at the kitchen table and looked through the notebook pages. He saw a pattern. Many entries were not truly about the past. They were about control. His mind wanted to correct the record so it could feel safe again. The correction never arrived, and the attempt kept the record open. Gordon turned to a fresh page and wrote a short line at the top. Enough for today. He did not mean it as inspiration. He meant it as a limit. He decided the notebook would not become an endless archive of grievances. It would become a place to set things down and then stop. Over the next week, he used the notebook differently. When a thought returned at night, he wrote it in one sentence and closed the cover. The closing was important. It was a signal to the mind that the case would not be tried again until morning, and often it did not need to be tried at all. The nights grew quieter. Not perfect, but quieter. Gordon began sleeping in longer stretches. He noticed that his days felt less brittle when his nights were less crowded. One evening, he invited his daughter and her family over for dinner. He cooked slowly, listening to the soft sounds of the house filling with people. His grandchildren talked while they ate, their voices light and unburdened. Gordon felt the present expand, as if it were finally allowed to take up more room than the past. After they left, he washed dishes and noticed that he was not replaying old meetings or old arguments. He was simply finishing a task and turning off the lights. Letting go, for Gordon, meant allowing the mind to close files that would never be amended. Peace arrived not by solving every old scene, but by refusing to keep revisiting them in the dark. On a mild morning, he took a slow walk through a nearby park. The path was damp and the air smelled like leaves and earth. He watched a dog pause to sniff the same patch of grass for a long time, unhurried and unconcerned with productivity. The small scene made Gordon smile. The dog did not need to justify its pace. He sat on a bench and let his thoughts come and go without catching them. A regret appeared, then drifted. A memory surfaced, then softened. He noticed that the mind can be loud when it believes it must keep running. When the body is allowed to rest, the mind often follows. At home, he opened the notebook again and tore out one page filled with angry rehearsals. He did not read it. He folded it once and dropped it into the trash. The gesture felt simple and final, like closing a drawer. He kept the notebook itself. He wanted a place for thoughts to land, but he no longer wanted a place for them to live. That night, he climbed into bed and turned off the lamp. The room was quiet. The ceiling did not invite argument. When an old story tried to return, Gordon touched the notebook, then left it closed. He let the story pass through like weather. He fell asleep with the sense that nothing needed to be fixed at 2 a.m. Nadia kept a shelf in her hallway closet for things she meant to return. A borrowed book, a small dish from a neighbor, a sweater her sister left behind. The shelf stayed full because returning items required small conversations, and Nadia had begun avoiding small conversations. Nadia was 59. She did not fear people, but she feared the small moment of exchange that might turn into obligation. Returning the dish might lead to an invitation. Returning the book might lead to a request. She told herself she was busy, Beneath busyness was a tired need to keep her boundaries invisible. One afternoon, she opened the closet and saw the shelf as if for the first time. The items looked harmless, yet they represented a pattern of delay. Nadia realized she was carrying unfinished loops, not because she wanted to hold on, but because she wanted to avoid the discomfort of completion. She chose the borrowed book and walked it to her neighbor's door. The neighbor opened with a warm smile and accepted it easily. There was no trap. No request followed. They spoke for a minute about the weather and the quietness of the street. Then Nadia went home. The exchange was simple, almost ordinary, and she felt surprised by the calm that followed. The next day, she returned the small dish. Again, the moment was brief. She noticed how much her mind had inflated the cost of these tiny interactions. Avoidance had been more exhausting than the conversations themselves. Over the week, she cleared the shelf. The closet looked cleaner, but the larger change was internal. Nadia felt the relief of closed loops. The relief was not about tidiness. It was about attention. Each unfinished loop had been a small hook in her mind, pulling at her in quiet moments. On Friday, her sister visited and noticed the clearer hallway. Nadia mentioned lightly that she had been finishing small things. Her sister nodded and said finishing small things can feel like taking back a room inside the mind. The sentence stayed with Nadia. That evening, Nadia sat at her kitchen table and made a list of other small loops. A dentist appointment she had postponed. A thank you note she meant to send. A cabinet door that needed a screw tightened. None were urgent. Together they formed a constant low pressure. She chose one and did it. Then she stopped. She did not turn the list into a new performance. She allowed it to be partial and human. Letting go, for Nadia, meant releasing the habit of postponing completion out of fear of what completion might invite. Completion did not always invite more. Often it invited quiet. The hallway shelf remained empty, and the emptiness felt like space. In that space, peace arrived in a simple way, as if it had been waiting behind the closed door of a small task. A few days later, the neighbor she had returned the dish to waved from across the street and asked if Nadia wanted to join a small gathering on Sunday. Nadia felt the old reflex to agree, and then resent it. She paused and listened to her body. She did not want the gathering. She wanted a quiet day. She said no, with a calm tone, and offered nothing more. The neighbor smiled and said, maybe another time. The response was so easy that Nadia almost laughed. The fear had been heavier than the moment itself. At home, she noticed a deeper point. Many of her delays were attempts to avoid choosing. A postponed return kept her in the role of the considerate neighbor without requiring a clear boundary. The shelf held objects, but it also held ambiguity. Clearing it forced honesty. On Saturday morning, she wrote a short note to her sister and mailed it. As she sealed the envelope, she felt a small satisfaction of something completed. That afternoon, she tightened the cabinet screw. She replaced a light bulb that had been dim for weeks. Each act took minutes. Each act reduced a small background tension she had treated as normal. When the house felt quieter, she realized how many tiny irritations had been living there like static. She did not aim for perfection. She aimed for less drag. That evening, she sat in her favorite chair and listened to the refrigerator hum. The sound was ordinary, but it no longer competed with unfinished tasks shouting for attention. The chair felt more comfortable when her mind was less crowded. On Monday, when her dentist office called to confirm an appointment, Nadia noticed the urge to reschedule. She kept the appointment. She allowed herself to do the mild, uncomfortable thing now, rather than keep paying for it later in worry and delay. The week ended with fewer hooks in her mind. The hallway shelf stayed clear. The closet door closed easily. Nadia noticed that letting go can be practical, even domestic. It can be a series of small, honest closures. Each closure returns a little attention to the present, and attention is where peace actually lives. Marcus kept a careful grip on his schedule, even after his workdays ended. He woke early, made lists, and filled empty hours with small chores. The structure had served him for decades. Without it, he feared a softness that felt like slipping. Marcus was 66. He had spent years being the dependable one, the person who handled details and prevented problems. Retirement gave him time, but time felt strange. It offered open space, and open space made him anxious. One morning, his wife suggested a drive with no destination. Marcus agreed, then immediately began naming places they could go. A small town, a park, a store with good pastries. His wife smiled and said the point was not to arrive somewhere. The point was to move without an agenda. They drove on back roads, passing winter fields and quiet houses. Marcus tried to relax, but his mind kept searching for a reason. He felt restless, as if the drive needed to produce a result to be justified. They stopped near a small river and walked along the bank. The water moved steadily without caring where it was going. Marcus watched light flicker on the surface. His wife stood beside him, silent, comfortable. The silence felt unfamiliar. Marcus realized how often he filled silence with planning. On the way back, they passed a small roadside stand selling early flowers. His wife asked if he wanted to stop. Marcus almost said no, then noticed that the no came from habit rather than preference. They stopped. He bought a small bundle of tulips and felt a mild surprise at how pleasant it was to make an unplanned choice. At home, he placed the tulips in a jar and set them on the table. The jar looked simple. The color in the room felt like a small gift. Nothing practical had been accomplished, yet the afternoon felt good. Later, Marcus sat with his list for the next day and crossed out 2 items. He did not replace them. He left the spaces open. The openness made him uneasy, then curious. He wondered what might happen if he stopped treating every hour like a duty. Over the next week, he practiced one unstructured period each day. Sometimes he sat outside in a chair and watched clouds move. Sometimes he listened to music and did nothing else. At first, the stillness felt like irresponsibility. Then it began to feel like rest. One afternoon, his adult son called with a question about a home repair. Marcus offered advice in a calm voice, then stopped himself from taking over. He did not drive across town. He did not assume the role of rescuer. He trusted his son to handle it. After the call, Marcus noticed a quiet relief. Letting go was not only about time, it was also about control. Marcus began to see that steadiness does not require constant management. A life can be held gently. The list can exist without ruling the day. The open spaces can exist without needing to be filled. In that gentler holding, peace appeared, not as an accomplishment, but as a simple state that returns when the grip loosens. On Saturday, he met his friend Ken for coffee. Ken spoke about learning to fish in retirement, not because he was good at it, but because it forced him to slow down. Marcus listened and realized he had been choosing activities that kept him busy, not activities that made him calm. Busy felt familiar. Calm felt exposed. He tried something new the following day. He took a book from a shelf and read in the middle of the afternoon. He did not read quickly. He did not take notes. He simply read until his eyes grew tired. The quiet pleasure felt almost childish, and the word childish softened into another word, simple. Later, he walked into the kitchen and saw the tulip still standing in the jar. A few petals had opened wider. The flowers were doing what flowers do, without instruction. Marcus felt a small tenderness in his chest and recognized it as relief. The world could move without his management. That night, his wife reached for his hand while they watched a movie. The gesture was small and ordinary. Marcus noticed that when he stopped organizing every minute, he noticed more of these gestures. Peace did not arrive in a lecture. It arrived in attention. In the following week, he left one afternoon open on purpose. He did not guard it with excuses. He simply left it open. When the hour came, he sat by the window and watched evening light change. He felt the old urge to stand up and do something, then let the urge pass. The room stayed quiet. The day stayed gentle. Marcus understood that letting go can be practiced the way a muscle is practiced. The grip loosens a little, then a little more, until the body remembers how to rest. Alma had a shelf of clothes she kept for a version of herself that no longer arrived. A jacket that fit 10 years ago, a pair of shoes she wore only once, a dress she saved for an event that never happened. The shelf was quiet, but it asked a question each time she opened the closet. Alma was 62. Her life was comfortable in many ways, yet she carried a private standard that followed her through mirrors and photographs. The standard was not loud, but it was persistent. It measured her against the past and treated change as a failure. One morning, she stood in front of the closet with a cup of coffee and felt a gentle exhaustion. The clothes were not the problem. The problem was the belief that she needed to return to an older shape to be acceptable. She had been keeping the shelf like a promise she could not keep. She took the jacket down and held it in her hands. The fabric was still good. The color still suited her. The size did not. She felt a flicker of shame, then noticed how quickly shame tried to become a story. If she kept the jacket, she could keep hoping. Hope, in this case, had begun to feel like pressure. Alma folded the jacket and placed it in a donation bag. She did the same with the shoes and the dress. Each item left her hands and took a small piece of tension with it. The closet looked emptier, and the emptiness felt like breathing room. That afternoon, her friend Beth came over to help sort the rest. Beth did not make the process dramatic. She simply sat on the floor and passed hangers back and forth. They laughed at old styles and remembered past events with mild warmth. The mood stayed light, and Alma noticed how different it felt to be witnessed without being judged. When the sorting was done, Alma hung only what she could wear now. The closet looked simple and practical. She felt a surprising calm. She realized she had not lost anything essential. She had lost an argument with time. In the days that followed, she noticed how much energy had been spent on silent comparison. The release gave her attention back. She walked more comfortably. She chose meals without turning them into negotiations. She took photographs with family and did not immediately search for flaws. Letting go, for Alma, meant releasing the belief that peace requires returning to a past body. Bodies change the way seasons change. The change does not need approval to be real. In accepting the present form, she found a quiet dignity that had been hiding beneath years of pressure. One weekend, she bought a new sweater that fit well and felt soft against her skin. The purchase was not a reward for improvement. It was a recognition of reality. She wore the sweater to dinner with Beth and felt comfortable in her chair, in her laughter, in her own life. The comfort was simple, and the simplicity was the peace she had been postponing. A week later, Alma visited her sister and helped set a table for a small family meal. Her niece snapped a few photos while everyone carried dishes to the dining room. Alma felt the old reflex to step aside, to avoid being captured in the background. She paused and stayed where she was. She held a bowl and smiled when someone made a quiet joke. The camera clicked, and the moment passed. When the photos were shared later, Alma looked at them with a different eye. She saw a woman holding food, surrounded by people, mid-laugh. The image did not look like the harsh story she had been telling herself. It looked like a life in motion, a life that did not require approval to be meaningful. At home, she noticed that the closet stayed quiet now. It did not hold a hidden demand. It held clothes that served her days. The absence of the old shelf felt like the absence of a voice that had been talking for years. She began applying the same release elsewhere. She stopped saving certain dishes for special occasions and used them on an ordinary Tuesday. She stopped waiting for the perfect energy to call a friend and called, while the house was still messy. Each act was small, but each act carried the same message. The present is allowed. Letting go did not erase her desire to be healthy. It simply removed the punishment from the desire. Alma still took walks. She still made choices that supported her body. The difference was tone. The choices were no longer fueled by shame. They were fueled by care. On a calm evening, she folded laundry and listened to music. The room felt soft. She caught her reflection in a dark window and did not flinch. She recognized herself as someone who had lived many days, carried many responsibilities, and still kept a gentle willingness to keep going. The recognition felt steady. The old pressure did not disappear forever, but it lost authority. Peace, for Alma, was the growing ability to live without arguing with the fact of time. Thomas kept his phone close at all times, not because he loved it, but because he feared missing something. A message from a family member, a request from a friend, a reminder from a group he supported. The phone was a small leash, and he rarely noticed it tugging. Thomas was 56. He had been reliable for most of his life. The person who answered quickly and handled problems without complaint. The reliability became a reputation. The reputation became an expectation. Over time, the expectation turned his attention into a public resource. He noticed the cost in the simplest moments. Sitting at the table with breakfast, his eyes would drift to the screen. Walking through a store, he would check for notifications. Even during a quiet movie, he would feel a nervous urge to confirm nothing needed him. One evening, his partner asked if he could put the phone away for dinner. The request was calm, not accusing. Thomas agreed, then felt an immediate spike of unease, as if the world might collapse in the next 30 minutes. He set the phone in another room and returned to the table. At first, he could not relax. He listened for phantom vibrations. He imagined urgent messages. Then, slowly, the unease softened. The room became clearer. The sound of utensils, the warmth of food, the presence of another person across the table. He realized how rarely he experienced dinner without being partially elsewhere. After dinner, he checked the phone. Nothing urgent had arrived. The world had continued without him. Thomas felt a small embarrassment at how convinced he had been that constant availability was necessary. The next day, he created a simple rule. The phone would stay out of reach during meals. and during the first hour of the morning. He told himself he could revisit the rule later. He did not treat it like a moral reform. He treated it like an experiment. The first few mornings felt strange. Without the phone, the mind looked for other ways to fill space. Thomas made coffee and stood near a window. He watched daylight widen along the street. The quiet felt empty at first. Then it began to feel like rest. In the afternoon, he met his friend Jun for a walk. Jun mentioned that he had begun turning off notifications for most apps. Jun said his nervous system felt calmer when the phone stopped acting like an alarm. Thomas listened and recognized the same need in himself. Over the next week, Thomas noticed that some messages could wait. Some requests could be answered later. The delay did not harm relationships. In fact, the delay gave his answers more calm. He was less reactive. He stopped reading every request as a test of loyalty. Letting go, for Thomas, meant releasing the belief that immediate response equals care. Care can be steady without being constant. Presence with one person can matter more than instant availability to everyone. As his phone loosened its grip, his attention returned to his own life, and peace arrived in the space where constant readiness used to live. On Saturday, his adult daughter visited with her partner for lunch. Thomas placed his phone in the other room without announcing it. The lunch moved slowly. Conversation stayed warm and ordinary. Thomas noticed details he often missed, the way his daughter paused before speaking, the small habits that showed she was becoming more like her mother. The noticing felt like a gift. After they left, he realized that the phone had been stealing not only calm, but intimacy. Being half present had become normal. Normal did not mean healthy. He adjusted his settings and turned off a handful of notifications. He kept calls from family available, but removed the constant drip of alerts that were not urgent. The first day felt quiet in a startling way. The second day felt easier. The silence was not boredom. It was relief. One evening, a friend sent a late message with a complicated request. Thomas read it and felt the old reflex to respond immediately. He set the phone down and waited until morning. In the morning, the request looked less urgent. He answered with a clear boundary and a calm tone. The boundary held. Over time, Thomas began reading again in the evenings, something he had abandoned without noticing. He sat in a chair with a lamp on and let pages move slowly. When his mind reached for the phone, he returned to the sentence in front of him. The return felt like reclaiming a small part of himself. Letting go did not make him unreachable. It made him more available to the life in the room. The phone remained a tool, not a tether. In that change, peace grew quietly, day by day, in the minutes that were no longer interrupted. Clara had a habit of fixing conversations after they ended. She would leave a gathering and replay every sentence, searching for what she should have said differently. The replaying was not vanity. It was a form of self-protection. If she could perfect the past, she believed she could prevent embarrassment in the future. Clara was 54. She was thoughtful, careful, often kind. Yet her mind treated kindness like a performance that could be graded. If she sensed she had disappointed someone, she carried the feeling home and tried to repair it alone through thinking. One evening she attended a small dinner at a friend's house. The conversation was easy, filled with ordinary stories. At one point, Clara offered an opinion that landed awkwardly. The room did not turn hostile. The moment simply passed. Clara laughed with the others, then felt the small prick of uncertainty as she drove home. In bed that night, the moment returned. Clara imagined faces. She imagined hidden judgments. The mind built a larger scene than the one that had actually happened. She lay awake and felt her body tighten as if preparing for a threat. The next morning, she met her friend Sarah for coffee and mentioned gently that she worried she had sounded insensitive. Sarah looked surprised and said she had not noticed anything unusual. Sarah described the dinner as warm and enjoyable. The reassurance was real, but what surprised Clara more was how casually it was offered. Sarah had not been keeping score. Clara realized that her mind was more severe than most people. The severity created a constant need to correct. The corrections never ended because the standard was impossible. A person cannot speak perfectly in every room. That afternoon, Clara tried a different practice when a replay began. She named it as a replay. She did not argue with it. She did not follow it down the hallway of the imagined consequences. She treated it like a habit, not like a truth. The practice felt small, still. It changed the evening. The replay appeared, then softened. Clara read a few pages of a book and noticed her mind returning to the words more easily than usual. Over the next week, she allowed herself to be slightly imperfect on purpose. She left a text message without adding extra explanation. She ended a phone call without rehearsing a final sentence. Each time, her nervous system wanted to rush back and check the damage. Each time, she let the urge pass. Letting go, for Clara, meant releasing the belief that safety depends on perfect social performance. Safety can also come from accepting normal human awkwardness. In that acceptance, her evenings became quieter. The world did not become smaller. Her mind became less crowded, and peace arrived in the space where endless self-editing had lived. On Saturday, Clara visited her mother and helped cook a simple meal. Her mother spoke about family news with a steady voice, then drifted into a familiar complaint about someone else's choices. Clara felt a reflex to correct, to fix the tone of the conversation, to make everything smoother. Instead, she listened and responded with a few neutral words. She did not take responsibility for her mother's mood. The choice felt quiet and respectful. Driving home, Clara noticed the relief. She had not harmed anyone. She had simply stopped managing what could not be managed. The relief felt like a new kind of strength. A few weeks later, she attended another gathering with the same group from the dinner. She arrived with a calmer intention. The intention was simple: be present. She spoke when she had something to say. She listened when she did not. When a sentence came out slightly clumsy, she let it pass without grabbing it back. At home afterward, the old replay tried to start. Clara noticed it and pictured the room as it truly was. People leaning in, laughing, eating, living. The room had not been a courtroom. It had been a table. She made tea, turned on a small lamp, and sat in a chair without reviewing the night. The calm felt unfamiliar. Then it felt natural. She understood that letting go does not require becoming careless. It requires trusting that most moments do not need correction. Over time, Clara began sleeping more easily. She stopped waking with a list of social repairs to perform. The peace that arrived was not a prize. It was what remained when her mind stopped treating every conversation as a test. In the quiet weeks that followed, she noticed something else. When she stopped spending nights correcting herself, she had more patience during the day. She could offer kindness without anxiety. She could enjoy people without fear. Letting go had returned her to the simple pleasure of being in a room and leaving it without taking the room home. Elliot had been keeping a storage unit for 5 years. The unit was not expensive, but it was persistent, a monthly bill tied to a part of his life he rarely touched. Inside were boxes from his previous house, furniture that did not fit his current rooms, and objects he told himself he might need someday. Elliot was 61. After a move and a difficult transition, he placed the boxes into storage as a temporary solution. Temporary became permanent. The unit held more than objects. It held unfinished grief. If he emptied it, he believed he would be admitting that a chapter was truly over. On a grey morning, he drove to the facility with a key in his pocket and a mild dread in his stomach. He rolled up the metal door and stood in front of the stacked boxes. The smell of cardboard and dust pulled him backward. He recognized old labels in his own handwriting. Kitchen, books, photos. He felt a wave of fatigue, as if the work were not physical, but emotional. He opened one box and found items that did not matter anymore. Old cords for devices he no longer owned. Papers that should have been shredded years ago. He realized the unit had been functioning as a delay. The delay protected him from deciding what belonged in his current life. He called his friend Adrian and asked if Adrian could meet him for an hour. Adrian arrived with coffee and a calm face. They worked side by side, not rushing. Adrian did not ask Elliot to explain every object. Adrian simply helped him lift, sort, and let go. As the unit cleared, Elliot felt a strange sadness, then an unexpected lightness. The sadness was honest. The past had been real. The lightness came from releasing the burden of carrying the past in the form of boxes. He found one item he wanted to keep, a small framed photograph of his parents when they were young. He wiped the glass with his sleeve and placed it carefully in the car. The photograph felt like memory held with respect, not memory held with clutter. By late afternoon, the unit looked larger and emptier. Elliot signed papers to end the rental. The finality made him pause. He expected fear. He felt relief instead. The relief was quiet, like a room after guests leave. Driving home, he realized that he had been paying for unfinished emotion. He'd been renting space for a chapter that could not return. Letting go did not mean forgetting. It meant allowing the past to become part of his story without needing to occupy a second building. That evening, he carried one box into his home and placed it in the corner of a room. He did not open it immediately. He allowed himself to rest. The next day, he would sort what belonged and release what did not. He did not need to do it all at once. Peace can come from a single decisive act, followed by gentle steps. In the following weeks, Elliot noticed a difference. The monthly bill was gone, but more importantly, the mental bill was gone. He stopped thinking of the unit as a responsibility waiting in the distance. The responsibility had been faced. The door had closed. The chapter remained in memory rather than in a rented aisle. In that change, his days felt lighter. A few days later, he invited Adrian over for dinner as a quiet thank you. They ate simple food and talked about ordinary plans. Elliot noticed how the room felt more spacious, not because furniture had changed, but because his mind was not holding a deferred task in the background. The conversation stayed easy. The ease felt like a reward that did not need to be earned. After Adrian left, Elliot walked through his home and noticed corners he had avoided decorating because he assumed the storage boxes might someday return. He moved a chair near a window and placed a lamp beside it. The small arrangement made the room feel lived in rather than temporary. He opened the remaining box and sorted slowly. A few items were kept. Most were released. The releasing felt less dramatic now that the larger decision had already been made. Each discarded object was not a loss. It was a reduction of noise. On a quiet Sunday morning, he sat in the new chair with coffee and looked out at the street. The day had no obligation attached to it. Elliot felt a soft gratitude that he could not have forced earlier. Letting go had created room, not only in a storage unit, but in his attention. The room did not fill immediately with new demands, and that surprised him. It stayed open, and the openness felt like peace. Joyce kept a habit of apologizing for her needs. If she asked for help, she apologized. If she declined a plan, she apologized. If she spoke about being tired, she apologized. The apologies were small and frequent, as if her existence required constant smoothing. Joyce was 58. She had learned early that peace in a family can come from being easy to handle. She carried that lesson into adulthood. She became dependable, agreeable, and careful. Over time, the carefulness turned into a quiet disappearance. One afternoon, she sat in a medical office waiting room, watching people come and go. A woman across the room asked the receptionist a straightforward question without apology. The woman sounded calm and unashamed. Joyce felt an odd mix of admiration and envy. The simple confidence looked like a kind of freedom. Later that day, Joyce met her friend Pam for lunch. Pam asked how Joyce was doing, and Joyce began to answer with her usual phrases, minimizing everything. Pam listened for a moment, then said, Joyce did not need to soften every sentence. The statement was gentle, but it landed sharply. Joyce realized how automatic the softening had become. In the following week, Joyce tried an experiment. She asked for a small favor from a co-worker without apologizing first. She thanked the co-worker afterward, but she did not add the familiar guilt. The co-worker agreed easily. Nothing else happened. Joyce felt the same surprise she had felt in the waiting room. The world did not punish her for taking up a little space. She practiced again at home. Her sister called with a request that Joyce normally would have accepted out of reflex. Joyce paused, checked her calendar, and said she could not. She did not explain at length. She did not apologize. She felt a rush of fear, then waited. Her sister sounded disappointed for a moment, then moved on. The disappointment did not become a disaster. Joyce noticed that the fear of displeasing someone had been running her life like a hidden rule. The rule demanded constant accommodation. The rule also created resentment that Joyce rarely admitted, even to herself. One evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down what she wanted more of. Quiet mornings. Fewer obligations. Time to cook a proper meal. A week that did not feel like constant caretaking. Seeing the list in plain words made the wants feel legitimate rather than indulgent. She began making small changes. She left one evening open. She said no to a request that drained her. She asked a family member to handle a task she always handled. The changes were not dramatic. Still, they shifted the weight of her days. Letting go, for Joyce, meant releasing the belief that being lovable requires being endlessly easy. Love can survive normal limits. Relationships can adjust. Peace arrived when she stopped treating every preference as an inconvenience and began allowing her own needs to be part of the room. Over time, her voice changed. It became calmer. The constant apology faded. In its place was a steadier presence, the kind that does not demand attention but does not erase itself either. Joyce discovered that letting go can be quiet and firm at the same time, and that quiet firmness can feel like peace. One Saturday, Pam invited Joyce to a small market. They walked past tables of fruit and bread, and Pam spoke about learning to stop volunteering for every extra task in her own life. Joyce listened and felt how similar the patterns were, different only in detail. That afternoon, Joyce visited her mother and helped put away groceries. Her mother began listing a series of upcoming errands Joyce could handle. Joyce felt the old reflex to accept them all. She chose one and declined the rest. Her mother looked startled, then adjusted the list aloud, finding other options. Joyce realized the list had never been fixed. It had been shaped by habit. Driving home, Joyce felt a nervous aftertaste, the feeling that she had done something wrong. She noticed the feeling and let it sit. The feeling did not prove wrongdoing. It proved that a pattern had been challenged. In the next weeks, the benefits became practical. Joyce had more time, but also more energy. When she did say yes, she said it with less resentment. She became more honest, and the honesty made her relationships clearer. One evening, she cooked dinner slowly and ate it without rushing. She noticed the simple pleasure of moving through a task without feeling that her time belonged to someone else by default. The quiet did not feel lonely. It felt like ownership. Letting go, for Joyce, was not a grand transformation. It was a gradual removal of unnecessary apologies. With each removal, a little air entered her days. In that air, peace did not need to be chased. It arrived naturally, like a room that finally has space to breathe. Robert kept his house spotless, not in a showy way, but in a vigilant way. Floors were swept daily. Counters were clear. Tools returned to their exact places. Visitors often said the home felt calm. Robert knew the calm had a cost. Robert was 64. He had grown up in a home where mess was treated like a moral failure. Cleanliness became a language of safety. If everything was in order, there would be less shouting, fewer surprises, fewer reasons for criticism. The habit stayed with him long after the original reasons disappeared. In retirement, the cleaning expanded into his days. He wiped already clean surfaces. He rearranged cabinets that had not been disturbed. He corrected small misalignments with the same intensity other people reserve for urgent problems. When his partner left a cup in the sink, Robert felt his body tighten as if a boundary had been crossed. One evening, his partner placed a hand on his arm and said the house did not need to be perfect to be peaceful. The sentence was gentle. Still, Robert felt defensive. Perfection had been his shield for so long that he did not know how to set it down without feeling exposed. The next morning, he tried a small experiment. He left the breakfast dishes for an hour before washing them. He walked past the sink and felt a spike of discomfort. The discomfort did not come from the dishes. It came from the old belief that disorder equals danger. He sat in a chair by the window and watched the street. The hour passed. Nothing happened. The house did not become chaotic. The day did not collapse. When he finally washed the dishes, he noticed that the act felt lighter because it was chosen. not compelled. Later that week, his grandson visited and played with building blocks on the living room floor. Blocks scattered and rolled under a chair. Robert felt the urge to gather them immediately. He watched his grandson's concentration and paused. The child was building with careful hands, creating small towers and laughing when they fell. The mess was part of the joy. Robert waited until the end, then helped collect the blocks. The room returned to order without urgency. He realized that letting disorder exist for a while did not mean surrendering his values. It meant letting life happen inside the house. Over the next month, he practiced leaving a few things imperfect on purpose. A blanket left draped over the sofa. Shoes placed neatly, but not perfectly aligned. A magazine left on the table overnight. Each imperfection felt like a small loosening. Each loosening made his breathing easier. He also noticed his partner relaxing. The air between them softened when the home stopped feeling like a test. Robert began to understand that his perfection had been asking other people to live inside his anxiety. Letting go, for Robert, meant releasing the belief that control is the only path to safety. Safety can also come from trust, from allowing ordinary mess to be ordinary. The house remained clean, but it became kinder. Peace arrived not through constant vigilance, but through the quiet decision to let a lived-in home be lived in. One evening, Robert turned off the kitchen light and saw a small smudge on the counter. He felt the reflex to return and wipe it. He paused, smiled faintly at himself, and walked to bed instead. The smudge could wait. The day could end without being perfected. In that small choice, he felt a calm that was deeper than cleanliness. On Saturday, he met his friend Luis for lunch. Luis mentioned that he had begun giving away old possessions, keeping only what he used. Luis said the house felt lighter when it stopped being a warehouse. Robert listened and recognized the same theme. Holding on can become a way to avoid fear. Releasing can become a way to regain peace. At home, Robert opened a cabinet and looked at stacks of items he never touched. Extra dishes, duplicate tools, old containers with missing lids. He felt a familiar resistance, then began sorting anyway. He filled a box for donation and another for recycling. He realized that some of his cleaning was not about dirt. It was about noise. The fewer objects he kept, the fewer objects demanded attention. That night, he and his partner sat on the couch with a blanket between them. The room was tidy, but not staged. A book lay open on a chair. A cup sat on a coaster. The small signs of living did not threaten him. They made the room feel human. Robert understood that letting go is often a series of small permissions. Permission for a cup to remain until morning. Permission for a child's blocks to scatter for an hour. Permission for a counter to have one smudge at the end of a long day. Each permission loosened the grip. Each permission returned him to the present, and the present was where peace could actually be felt. In the later years, the shape of a life changes in ways that cannot be negotiated. Some changes arrive loudly. Some arrive as small shifts that only become visible after months have passed. A person notices a different reaction to noise, a different tolerance for clutter, a different desire for distance from arguments that once felt important. The older mind begins to recognize how many burdens were carried by habit rather than necessity, and how many anxieties were mistaken for responsibility. Across many ordinary days, letting go happens in plain scenes. A drawer that finally closes. A short sentence that ends an obligation without apology. A calendar that holds one quiet afternoon instead of another duty. A set of tools passed to younger hands. A message thread archived and left untouched. A box in a closet returned to the dark without being reopened. A phone left in another room while dinner becomes a real meal again. A shelf cleared of borrowed objects and returned to its simple emptiness. What changes is not the world itself. What changes is the grip. The mind loosens its demand for perfect closure. The body loosens its constant bracing. The heart loosens its old contracts. The ones that say love must be earned through exhaustion, that worth must be proven through usefulness, that peace must wait until everything is fixed. Those contracts are often written without consent, signed early, enforced for decades, and forgotten until the day they begin to feel too heavy to keep. Some releases are visible to others, and some are private. A person stops rehearsing an old argument while washing dishes. A person stops scrolling through the same memory late at night. A person stops inventing a storm out of a small request. A person stops explaining every boundary as if it were a crime. These changes do not create drama. They reduce it. They pull attention back from the past and from imagined futures and return it to the hands, the room, the hour. When the grip loosens, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is room. Room for a morning to start without urgency. Room for a conversation to be simple. Room for a house to look lived in without feeling like a failure. Room for a past that was imperfect to stay in the past without being tried again every night. Room for the present to be treated as sufficient. In that room, care becomes quieter and steadier. It no longer needs to announce itself through constant availability. It no longer needs to prove itself through overwork. It can be expressed in a meal cooked slowly, in a hand resting on an arm, in a walk taken at an easy pace, in a phone call returned when the voice is calm instead of hurried. The body notices the difference first. Sleep comes in longer stretches. The jaw unclenches. The shoulders sit lower. The day feels less like a sprint. Peace does not arrive as a single decision that ends all strain. It arrives as a steady sequence of small releases, each one modest enough to be repeated. A person sets down one unnecessary burden. The shoulders drop by a fraction. Breath becomes easier. The day becomes more spacious. The next release becomes possible. Slowly, life begins to feel less like something to manage and more like something to inhabit. There are still disappointments. There are still days that feel tight. Letting go does not remove all difficulty, and it does not erase the ordinary sorrow of time moving forward. It simply stops adding unnecessary weight. It stops turning every flaw into a verdict and every pause into a failure. It allows a person to meet a day as it is, not as it was supposed to be. Near the end of a day, the light changes in a way that cannot be rushed. The house grows quieter. The sounds of distance soften. A person moves through familiar rooms and notices that nothing needs to be proven to let the night be gentle. There can still be work to do tomorrow. There can still be uncertainty in the weeks ahead. Even so, the evening can be allowed to rest. In that permission, a different kind of strength becomes visible. It is the strength of leaving some things unfinished and still feeling whole. It is the strength of accepting the limits of time without turning those limits into a fight. It is the strength of allowing what matters to remain simple and allowing the rest to fall away. The day closes the way a drawer closes when it is no longer overfilled. Quietly, cleanly, without force. The mind slows. The body settles. The room holds steady. And the peace that follows is not a reward. It is what remains when the grip has finally eased.